Hi everyone, please subscribe to my channel. Blood Immortal Venerable. See playlist for other chapters and novels. I do not translate the novels. Credits goes to original translator and author of the novel. I only make it as an audiobook so it would be easier to just listen while doing other things. Credits goes to the author of the novel. I convert stories to audiobook for mental health, for multitasking purpose, for accessibility and time saving. Listening to audiobook is also beneficial for people who have disability. It improves our listening skills and improve our English comprehension, vocabulary and other things. So, thank you for listening. Thank you and thank you very much for your support. Chapter 2721, Dragon Path. Once Zen left, Callum turned to a servant and said, "Fetch me the Dragon Path array plate." The servant gave a short bow, went into the palace, and returned with an unadorned array plate in hand. The road from here to the mountain peak was named the Dragon Path and had existed ever since work on the palace had completed. This ancient path was covered by many major arrays that intended to protect the path by taking lives of intruders. Sword arrays like the Hacking Sword Array and the Fallen Sword Array provided fundamental protection for the Oneness Sky Palace. Callum wasn't high-ranked enough to have his hands on all those sword arrays. The array plate he was holding controlled the Cloudy Mountain Array that was built to test climbers trying to scale the mountain. For a while at the beginning, the palace didn't build the Dragon City. Anyone wanting to join the palace had to go straight up the mountain. Every day, there were countless people climbing the mountain. Hundreds and thousands of them would fail the Cloudy Mountain Array. Once the Dragon City was built, it became difficult even to become qualified to climb the mountain. This person is at the first stage of the Other Shore realm. The 8th class difficulty will do, said Callum. The 8th class, Sellers was surprised. Callum glanced at Sellers and asked, "What's wrong? You're afraid it's too difficult for him?" The array plate Callum was holding could adjust the difficulty of the Cloudy Mountain Array. The 8th class was the easiest of the lot. It was suitable for Zen's cultivation level. Sellers chuckled and said, "If you set it at the 8th class, we might witness a new record today." Callum thought for a while and said, "If you think so highly of him, I'll set it at the 7th class." Sellers didn't say anything. It was no big deal for Zen to walk the Dragon Path. It was just one way to get him up the mountain. Sellers was thinking to himself that even though Zen was only at the first stage of the Other Shore realm, he could easily handle a 5th or even a 4th class Cloudy Mountain Array. The 7th or 8th class wouldn't even slow him down. Sellers turned out to be right. After Callum activated the array plate, the Dragon Path started glowing and emitting light. The path ahead looked like a curled-up dragon, zigzagging right up to the mountain top. For someone at the first stage of the Other Shore realm, the current record for the 7th class difficulty is 12 hours. "I have activated the array," Callum said, looking puzzled. Zen should have slowed down drastically the moment the array was activated. But it looked like the array wasn't affecting Zen one bit. He was ascending even faster. Is he actually speeding up? Callum turned to ask Sellers. Sellers laughed and said, "Yes." Callum was astonished. He wondered if the array was broken. But the Cloudy Mountain Array was designed by the higher-ups from the palace and had been working perfectly for several years now. How could it be broken? Besides, the array plate was working just fine. At this rate, 4 hours will be enough for him to reach the top, Sellers said with a smile. "That's impossible," Callum said, shaking his head. "He is fast now, but he may not last long. I think he's using some secret method to boost himself." However, an hour later, Callum became restless. Zen wasn't slowing down. On the contrary, it looked like he was gaining speed. If he kept accelerating at this rate, he would finish the whole path in 3 hours. "Let's set it at the 6th class." Callum upped the difficulty level using the array plate. For someone at the first stage of the Other Shore realm, a 6th class difficulty was quite ambitious. Once Callum leveled up the difficulty, he saw Zen slow down for an instant. But it only took him about 10 seconds to recover and continue ascending at a mind-numbing speed. Callum looked confused. He grabbed the array plate and shook it, as if to see if it was indeed broken. "Sellers, my friend, who is this guy?" He finally understood why Sellers was so confident about Zen. "You've seen the sword card." "It was from Master Athamar," replied Sellers. Callum shook his head in disbelief. He had lived in the Cloudy Mountain Palace for long and he was finally coming to understand that Zen was no regular guy. "If that's the case, we should make it even harder." As he spoke, he raised the difficulty to the 5th class. But Zen acquainted himself with the 5th class difficulty pretty easily after a short adjustment period in which he slowed down for a bit. Callum watched Zen's figure on the array plate, speechless. Was it suggesting that the change in the levels of difficulty made no difference to Zen? I'm going to challenge the young man with a 4th class difficulty now. If he fails, I'll report it accordingly and send him up the mountain myself, said Callum. It was beyond his understanding. Shaking his head, he turned up the difficulty to the 4th class. He was surprised yet again, his expression freezing as if he had seen a ghost. Callum's reaction amused Sellers, but he tried not to laugh. Fortunately for him, he was wearing a mask, his expressions guarded from everyone. He had known that Zen would be surprisingly fast. Callum then adjusted the array to the 3rd class without uttering a word. The 3rd class was supposed to be really difficult, especially for a young man at the 1st stage of the Other Shore realm. Milo had also been at the 1st stage of the Other Shore realm when he had challenged the Dragon Path. Back then, the members of the Flow Sword sect had made Callum set the difficulty at the 3rd class for Milo, and then turn it up to the 2nd class. Milo had still made it to the mountain top. But Milo was a talent with instant enlightenment, and the palace regarded him as a treasure. A talent like Milo didn't have to be tested by the Dragon Path. The Flow Sword sect had sent him here for fun, and he had, in the process, set the highest record of all time. Would Callum compare Zen with Milo? That was impossible. The 3rd class difficulty did slow Zen down. He had ascended so fast because he had ignored the swords coming towards him. He wouldn't get hurt no matter how the flying swords came after him. Zen had, by now, covered 2/3 of the path. The flying swords were gaining power now. He had to spare some strength to destroy them, and also occasionally dodge them. Zen came up with an idea so that he could ascend even faster. His arms turned black underneath the sleeves. He held his arms up to protect his head, and sped up once again. The flying swords were like raindrops, and the force contained within was several times stronger than that of the swords in Sword Tower. But they only numbed Zen's arms, without leaving a mark. Has he sped up again? Callum exclaimed, his eyes wide in astonishment. This wasn't what he had expected to see. Even Sellers was surprised now. He had always thought that there was quite a huge gap between Zen and Milo, but it now looked like the gap had diminished greatly. Chapter 2722, The Heavenly Magic Array. Catching Callum looking at him, Sellers chuckled. I don't know much about Zen. He has already passed the 3rd floor of the Sword Tower, and has fought with Milo once. What was the result? Queried Callum. Zen lost, Sellers said bluntly with a slight shrug. Milo has been in the mountain for a long time, and his cultivation level is higher than Zen's. It's not surprising Zen lost. But it's hard to tell this young man's potential, Callum said, scratching his chin. Then, he raised the array plate again. If he can climb the mountain under the 2nd class difficulty, he might be able to be compared with Milo's past self. Although Sellers gave his recommendation for Zen to go up the mountain, to be clear, he just wanted to do Athomar a favor. One way or another, Zen was qualified to climb the mountain. However, in actuality, Sellers was also curious to see just how strong Zen truly was. Please make the decision by yourself, Master Callum, said Sellers, bowing slightly. If Zen got hurt, Athomar would put the blame on him. Sellers didn't want to be used as a scapegoat. Watching Zen gradually recover his speed, Callum gritted his teeth as he changed the array plate again. The difficulty of the Cloudy Mountain array on the Dragon Path could only reach up to 3rd class. However, a 2nd class of difficulty was later added with the use of the Heavenly Magic Array. Therefore, once someone started the 2nd class difficulty, the Heavenly Magic Array was also activated. That was exactly what happened to Zen. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The moment Zen took another step, flying swords shot towards him. The flying swords alone were nothing to him. He indifferently moved forward at an incredible speed. Then, some of the flying swords collided with his arms. Bang, bang. The flying swords released clouds of smoke and suddenly transformed into chains that wrapped themselves around Zen's arms. At the end of each chain was a large, cone-shaped weight. Wow, the weights are heavy. Each of them probably contains 1 divine megaton of force. Zen grunted as he struggled to keep moving forward, despite the chains. He frowned as he realized that back when he first entered the Dragon City, he couldn't even lift these heavy weights. The Heavenly Magic Array was changeable. This was just one of its changes. When faced with the winged sun crow race, this magic array could drag countless sun crows down the mountain. 2 or 3 weights usually wouldn't hinder Zen. However, the further he ran, the more flying swords volleyed towards him, exploding into more weights. Soon, Zen was dragging 60 weights, which meant that he was carrying 60 divine megatons of force. It was like 60 his past selves who just entered the Sea of Truth were dragging him. Even people as powerful as Zen had their limits. Beads of sweat dripped down his face as he struggled to keep moving. I have to get rid of these weights, he said as he panted. If he kept at it, he knew more and more chains would coil around his body, weighing him down till he wouldn't be able to move. Without further hesitation, Zen summoned the snow sword and hacked at the chains. The metal and iron collided together, but no crisp sound was heard. It seemed that he cut into the air. It seems this magic array can't be broken by brute force, Zen muttered in frustration. While the weights and chains were just an illusion, the many divine megatons of force wasn't. Bang, bang, while he hesitated, more long swords exploded in front of him. As the chains wrapped around Zen, he realized he was carrying around 100 weights by now. Buckling under this much weight, he could barely take another step. In the cloudy mountain palace, Callum smiled. Milo had also been trapped for a long time at that stage, he reminisced. However, he is truly a genius. He controlled the swords with his mind, ignoring the obstacle illusions, successfully breaking the magic array eventually. If Zen can't break it, I'm afraid he won't be able to reach the top of the mountain. However, Callum had promised before that, even if Zen was trapped in the second-class difficulty, he would personally send him up the mountain. They were now making things difficult for Zen, testing him to see his true strength. Bang, 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 more and more flying swords hung around Zen's body. After a while, more than 100 swords weighed him down. The heavy weight was pulling him down. It was difficult for him to even stand up straight. He thought he heard his bones crunching under the great force. If I want to break this magic array, I have to use some special methods. In that case. He closed his eyes, brows furrowed. He awoke his eye of wool, and he felt his inner world tremble slightly. When he opened his eyes again, his right eye emitted a pale white light. The world he saw with his right eye had changed into another shape. His left eye could clearly see the swords flying towards him. However, from the vision of his right eye, he saw the flying swords as magic symbols floating towards him. The moment they got too close, they burned a bright red and transformed into a cloud of dust that stuck to his back. That was why he could feel the chains weighing him down. I see, Zen said with a smile. Immediately, he began to tear off the magic symbols that had accumulated on his back. Bang, a burst of white smoke exploded, and the magic symbols were quickly burned to ashes. The weights that Zen saw in his left eye all disappeared. After that, he felt much relaxed and stretched his body. Then he turned into a ray of light and flew along the dragon path. Zen saw the real world with his right eye, where magic symbols were floating towards him. With his left eye he saw an illusion, where flying swords were shooting towards him. Break into pieces. As Zen brandished the snow sword, a stream of thin sword radiance was created. The sword radiance touched the magic symbols and immediately cut them into pieces. The magic array was not a threat to Zen. For him, the difficulty at the second class was even easier for him than the third. Now climbing the mountain was like walking on the flat ground. Zen's speed. In the cloudy mountain palace, Callum and Sellers were flabbergasted. It took less than 10 minutes for Zen to destroy the magic array after Callum activated the difficulty of the second class. The heavenly magic array was not difficult for him at all. There was an essential difference between the heavenly magic array and the cloudy mountain array. The cloudy mountain array was used for the assessment, but the heavenly magic array was used to resist the enemy. Since the Oneness Sky Palace was built, very few people had managed to destroy the heavenly magic array with their own strength. Zen was merely at the first stage of the other shore realm, but he made it. How did he make it? Can Zen also control the swords with his mind? Callum and Sellers could only see his figure on the array plate and didn't know how Zen did that. Shall we activate the first class difficulty? Sellers asked with a mischievous smile. Callum shook his head immediately and clutched the plate tightly. Fearing he wouldn't be able to resist the temptation, he said decisively, no. The first class difficulty will kill him. If anything bad happens to Zen on the dragon path, Master Athamar will have me killed. Relax, it was just a suggestion. Sellers laughed. Together, they returned their focus towards Zen. Much to their surprise, Zen had already almost made it to the mountain's peak. That's half the time it took Milo. Callum murmured. Chapter 2723, Treatment. When Zen emerged from the dragon path, a gate appeared before him. Zen stopped in his tracks, stunned at the sight of the gate. The gate was formed from two pieces of weathered dead wood standing upright a few feet away from each other, with a cracked board above them. Lack of maintenance over the years had caused all the inscriptions on the board to disappear. The board just hung there, nothing on it. Who would have thought that the famous Oneness Sky Palace had a gate that was in such a dilapidated condition? Zen passed through the gate and continued walking. The road forked in 3 paths ahead of him. These 3 paths were paved with stone bricks, each with a different variety. The path on the left was paved with thick, wide, cyan stone bricks engraved with landscape paintings. It looked grand and majestic. The path on the right was paved with black stone bricks. He had no idea what the stone bricks were made of, but they looked solid and gave off the aura of history and eternity. The path in the middle was paved with small red stones. They were light and dynamic, giving off a sharp aura. Looking at the paths in front of him, Zen hesitated. Hadn't they said that someone would be here to receive him when he came up here? Why hadn't he seen anyone? Zen looked at the 3 paths again as he thought. The answer came to him soon enough. The test wasn't over. He had to make a choice, and there was no hint. Zen made a decision after a while. He chose the path with the red bricks. He took a step in that path and then began to climb up the stairs, accelerating as he climbed. He walked along the road for more than 20 miles, and then came to a ridge. He passed it, and came across a board. The board was inscribed with the words, Flow Sword Sect. Zen's eyebrows went up when he saw the board. He had made the right choice by following his heart. After his fight with Fergus, Zen had also become interested in the Flow Sword Sect. There were a few similarities between the flow strike and the emotion-closing godly way that he had cultivated. This was a path that was suitable for him. He stood under the board for a while. He then saw 2 women in white saunter over to him from the other side of the board. One of them folded her hands towards Zen in respect and said, "Sir, are you Mr. Luo?" Zen Luo. "Yes, I am," Zen said, nodding. "You can come with us if you choose to join the Flow Sword Sect. But I have to remind you that you still have the chance to give this path up and go back to choose from the other 2 paths," one of the women said. "Where do the other 2 paths lead to?" "The one on the left leads to the Killing Sword Sect, and the one on the right leads to the Unique Erase Sword Sect," she answered. The 3 paths were merely options for the warriors who went up the mountain to choose freely. If they really didn't like the ones they had chosen, they could go back and choose again. But they could choose only once. Once they entered any of the sects, they couldn't join other sword sects unless they left the Oneness Sky Palace. "Are there any differences between the 3 sword sects?" Zen asked. It was not the first time that the woman in white had faced this question. She smiled as she answered him. "The Killing Sword Sect mainly focuses on cultivating the killing way. It pursues the strongest means to hurt the enemy, so as to kill them as quickly as possible. Unique Erase Sword Sect, according to its name, mainly focuses on cultivating sword arrays." "What about the Flow Sword Sect?" Zen asked again. "Follow your heart and go with the flow," the woman replied succinctly. Zen had dabbled in both the sword arrays and the killing way before. At the woman's answer, he went through the gate unhesitatingly. The 2 women in white led the way. Rows of trees lined the road on both sides. The surroundings were quiet and there was not a single person around. "It looks like there aren't many people in the Flow Sword Sect," Zen said. "No, there are actually a lot of people, but everyone is focused on cultivation. You certainly won't be seeing them soon," one of the women replied. Zen nodded and quietly followed the 2 women. The boulevard was 10 miles long. When they came to the end of the boulevard, a number of beautifully shaped buildings appeared before them. Rows and rows of buildings were lined up, densely packed against each other and forming an exquisite small city. It looked like there were indeed many people in the Flow Sword Sect. About 6 feet separated each building from the next. The 2 women led Zen through narrow alleys, and Zen saw several other women in white along the way. They had pretty looks, and their clothes were plain and neat. But Zen was curious about why there was no one else besides these women. When they stopped in front of a building, one of the women turned and bowed to Zen as she said, "Mr. Luo, we have arrived." "Here." Zen was a little surprised. "This place is for you," the woman said. Curious, Zen pushed open the door of the building. There was a long table in the yard, on which were neatly folded white clothes, a sword, a token, and even shoes and hats. Zen glanced at the token and saw his name engraved on it. He smiled and said, "The Flow Sword Sect has prepared everything for me." "That's considerate, but what would have happened if I hadn't chosen it? Wouldn't all these go to waste?" "You have the liberty to make your own decisions," the woman said with a smile. Zen looked carefully at the long table and found that there were 2 space rings on it. He picked up one of the space rings and examined it, only to find that it contained 1,000,000 divine crystals within it. He then picked up the other space ring and found that there were 10 golden square cards within it. He took out a card and asked, "What is this?" "The entry token to the Flow Tower. 2 hours in the Flow Tower costs an entry token. They are very rare in the sect, so please take care of them," the woman said. The long sword on the table was ranked decently high. It was an intermediate profound blood treasure. There were 1,000,000 divine crystals in one of the space rings, but the two women seemed to be indifferent to it all, not even bothering to explain everything to him. They had only explained the entry tokens, making it look like they were very important. The Flow Sword sect is so generous. Do all the disciples who join the sect receive such treatment? Zen asked. The woman smiled. Those who can successfully go up the mountain are considered members of our Oneness Sky Palace. This treatment is only a small gift. Zen sighed as he looked out upon the exquisite courtyard. There was a stark difference in how he was treated here and how he was treated at the foot of the mountain. In the Dragon City, both the Flag Masters and the Alliance Chiefs didn't even have a cave, let alone a building like this. Each of them only had a flag and everyone just lived and cultivated in the open air. The living conditions were poor. Mr. Luo, you must be tired, having climbed all the way here. I'll help you take a bath and change your clothes, the woman said and walked to the side of the building. The other woman went to gather up the clothes, shoes, and hats from the table. Zen was stunned. He looked at the two women curiously and asked, "You don't need to do these things, do you?" The woman said, "You have now entered the house, and you are the master of this place. We are your maids, so of course we will serve you." Chapter 2724, Being Idle. Zen was stunned when he heard the young woman in white call herself a maid. Maids. She smiled and nodded. "Yes, you can call me Trish. I'm Carrie," the other woman in white said, introducing herself. Zen shook his head. "Why you two are maids? This place has been given to you by the Sword Sect. Everything in it belongs to you, including us," said Trish. "Are the other disciples of the Flow Sword Sect also treated like this?" Zen asked, persistent in his questions. "Yes," Trish replied firmly, nodding her head. Zen hadn't met any other disciples on his way to the Flow Sword Sect. He had only met several women dressed in white, like Trish and Carrie. He had been a little curious at the time, but it was only now that he realized that all of them were maids of the disciples of the Flow Sword Sect. "Can I just live here without a maid?" Zen asked. Since the Flow Sword Sect had given him such a large courtyard, Zen could even invite Letitia and the others to stay with him. He didn't need anyone taking care of him. Trish was disappointed. "We are responsible for conveying the news of the Sword Sect and need to deal with a lot of things for you. I'm afraid you'll find it difficult to adapt to this place without us. Moreover, it's our duty to serve you. If you don't need us, we will be asked to leave the mountain," Carrie added. The disappointment on both their faces roused sympathy in Zen. He had just entered this place, which was why he hadn't been able to adapt to it yet. And as Trish had said, there must be a reason why everyone had maids to take care of them. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. And it would be rude to drive them away. If that's the case, you can all stay here. But you don't need to serve me when I take a bath, Zen said, shaking his head. Trish and Carrie looked at each other, nodding happily. Zen took the white clothes and shoes and went to the room in the courtyard. Once Zen had left, Carrie whispered to Trish, "Trish, Mr. Luo's cultivation base seems to be low. I've noticed that the warriors that the other maids serve seem to be stronger than him." Trish shook her head and replied, "The Flow Sword Sect only cares about and appreciates his potential, but not his strength. Have you heard about Milo? His cultivation base was also at just the first stage of the other shore realm when he arrived here. But he then made great progress and became a super powerful warrior. Do you think Mr. Luo is as talented as Milo?" Carrie asked, her eyes wide. Everyone in the Flow Sword Sect knew Milo. Even Carrie had heard of him. "No," said Trish, shaking her head. "There are only a few talents like Milo in the entire Oneness Sky Palace. Few people can compare with him. But I also think Mr. Luo is not that bad. Do you think Mr. Luo will let us sleep with him?" Carrie asked. Trish blushed at her words and asked shyly, "What are you talking about?" These maids had been selected by the Flow Sword Sect from the Bloom Divine Province. Their cultivation base was okay and all of them had reached the True God realm. Every time a warrior joined the Flow Sword Sect, maids would be assigned to the new disciples. If the maids performed well while serving the disciples, they would receive rewards from the Flow Sword Sect. Some maids even fell into romantic relationships with the disciples and even married them in order to cultivate together. The strong smell of medicine wafted out of a big bathtub from the bathroom, shrouded in steam. Everyone can do whatever they want without any taboos or restrictions. The Flow Sword Sect is so special, Zen muttered, smiling. The Flow Sword Sect was far beyond Zen's comprehension. There was no one to instruct him and help him understand the ways of the Sword Sect. But the house he had been assigned had satisfied him. Everything confused him here and he couldn't understand why the sword sect treated the disciples in such a strange way. Zen needed to figure it out bit by bit. Zen pulled on his clothes once he emerged from the bath. He looked different in the white clothes, more energetic and refreshed. Once he emerged from the room, the two maids walked up to him. Trish said, "Mr. Luo, if you are tired, I'll go make the bed for you. It is our lunch break now." Wow, Zen was stunned at this. Try as he might to adapt to this lifestyle, every second he spent here simply blew his mind. A warrior, irrespective of whether or not they had a high cultivation base, would be full of energy all day long and didn't need lunch breaks. Is this a place for cultivation? Or is it for vacation? Zen thought to himself in confusion. Do the others do the same? Zen asked. Trish nodded and smiled. Yes. She had expected Zen to have such a reaction. Every other Shore Realm warrior who had just arrived here reacted the same way as Zen did. They don't need to cultivate? Zen asked again. The way you live here is considered cultivation in the Flow Sword sect, said Trish. Well, let me see what they intend to do, Zen said. According to Zen's original plan, he should have started cultivating by now. He could either practice the sword texture technique or go to the other shore, but he was doing nothing. He walked leisurely around the yard. When it was time to take the noon break or go to bed at night, he went to sleep alone. He didn't need to sleep. Even when he was lying on the bed, he was only meditating. During the daytime, he stepped out of the courtyard and walked along the alley, only encountering a few women in white who were passing by. Zen had thought to find a disciple of the Flow Sword sect to clarify a few doubts. But a week passed and he was yet to meet a disciple. Do these people stay in their rooms all the time? Or am I the only disciple in the entire Flow Sword sect? He thought. As time went by, he got more and more confused. Zen wanted to knock on one of the other doors to ask around about what was going on. But the moment he walked through the gate of a courtyard, the women in white shut the door in his face. He ended up staying away and not knocking on any door. Zen shook his head as he walked back along the alley. On his way back, he could hear the women laughing and whispering in the other courtyards. He knew what had happened without even looking inside. Oh my goodness, what is this place? Zen found this place to be even more mysterious and dangerous than all the places he had explored so far. His lips curled up in a curious yet wary smile as he made his way back alone. He wasn't someone who could waste time while leading an idle life. He had even begun to miss his days in the Dragon City. No one was paying much attention to him. So he found a quiet corner in his own courtyard, set up a restriction array, and started to cultivate the sword texture technique. He cultivated this way for half a month. Once he finished cultivating, he handed a space ring to Trish and asked her to give it to Monica, who was in the Dragon City. Within the ring sat the sword reading liquid. Before going up the mountain, Zen had agreed that Monica could get 30% of the profit once the sword reading liquid was sold, and he would take the rest of it. He would replenish the sword reading liquid once every month. Trish was capable, and it only took her one day to take the ring back. Zen counted and found that there were nearly 20 million divine crystals in it. Mr. Luo, what is in this space ring? It looks mysterious, Trish asked. Nothing extraordinary, Zen said, shrugging his shoulders. He wasn't going to tell anyone about the sword reading liquid. He was about to put away his space ring when a resounding bell chime sounded from the distance. Chapter 2725, A Strange Test. When he heard the sound of the bell echo across his ears, Zen felt excited. Finally, if it continued like this, he might give up and head back to Dragon City. Did the bell ring to assemble the disciples? Zen asked with curious eyes. Seeing his hopeful expression, Trish pursed her lips and shook her head. No, Mr. Luo, it rings at the beginning of each month, by customary rule. What does it mean? Zen asked, listening intently. Nothing, it's just a friendly reminder that a new month has begun, Trish replied. Quote. Disappointed by her words, Zen sighed and closed the door without uttering a word. Observing Zen's profile, Trish bit her tongue and turned to Carrie while giving her shoulders a shrug. Carrie raised her eyebrows slightly and said, "It seems Mr. Luo is very impatient." According to them, I'm afraid that it's difficult for Mr. Luo to achieve anything in the Flow Sword sect, Trish said while shaking her head. Forget about that, I think he is a good man. He is polite and gentle, said Carrie. Even after listening to Carrie speak highly of Zen, Trish still had a grim look on her face. The reason why she became a servant girl of the Flow Sword sect was that she had missions to fulfill. What she loathed was being outshone by other maids. If Zen didn't perform well, she would be disappointed. But She did not have the privilege of choosing her master, so she could only suppress her disappointment in her heart. As the darkness of the night cloaked the sky, the stars that were shy to shine in the day flaunted their light. As if that was their cue, the doors to the courtyards opened, one by one. Servant girls in white appeared to step out of each gate before they walked along the alleys. Zen quickly spotted Trish stepping out of the door. Suddenly he was alerted, and he released a wisp of spiritual sense to follow after her. Like all the other girls, Trish walked in a single direction without uttering a word to anyone. As soon as they crossed the alleys, Zen felt a powerful force shatter his spiritual sense, breaking his connection with her. The girls in white quickly flocked into a palace and waited for someone to arrive. There were 5 golden pots scattered across the room. The girls stood in a row in front of them. After a short while, several women entered the palace one after the other. The head of the group was a fancy-looking woman. She gave a tantalizing smile to the girls and said, "A month has passed. Did you do everything your masters asked you to do?" Her words were filled with mockery to the girls. But that was how things were at the Flow Sword sect, blunt and free. Hearing what she said, the girls in white burst into laughter. "My master is really great. He always," a girl in white said as she fumbled with her hand and seemed flustered. "He always what?" the glamorous woman asked as she leaned forward, urging the girl to give more details. "You know, the girl looked down, feeling shy. The group began to giggle among themselves. Then the woman continued to ask the other girls about what their masters had done, such as the number of baths and sex they had. But she didn't inquire about cultivation even once. While listening to the stories of their masters from the girls, the woman took out bamboo slips with their masters' names engraved on them. Carefully, she rated the narratives and slid the slips into different pots placed in front of the girls. Each pot was graded, excellent, very good, good, fair, and poor. The answers she got from the girls were all rated by the pots she placed the slips in. This went on for about 6 hours. She listened keenly and then slid the bamboo slips into the pots she saw fit. Only a handful of bamboo slips made it into the excellent pot, a few of them in the very good pot, and most of them in the good pot. The girls would celebrate if their masters were rated excellent, but they wouldn't be so happy if they fell into the very good or good division. How their masters performed was how their wages were determined every month. The payment for fair and poor would prove insufficient as they would bring almost nothing to the girls. Fortunately, none of the masters fell in those 2 rates. "Your master is a newcomer. Is he doing well?" the woman asked a girl standing beside Trish. The girl answered honestly, "During his stay in the mountain, for over 20 days, he played the zither, painted pictures, and had fun with us. He's talented and has a good heart." Hearing the girl's answer, the woman gave a satisfied look and placed her bamboo slip into the very good pot. Then, she switched her gaze towards Trish and asked, "Trish, how did you serve your master?" Suddenly, all eyes were now on Trish, waiting in anticipation for her answer. Naturally, she felt embarrassed. She began to speak while stumbling for the right words. "My master. He set up an enchanted barrier on the 7th day and cultivated inside, so I don't know what he has done since then." As she finished speaking, the other girls broke out in explosive laughter. "Trish, has he chosen the wrong path? It's not a good idea for him to cultivate in the Flow Sword sect. He will be driven out, won't he?" Trish clenched her fists and gritted her teeth. With a frown she continued reporting. But the more she spoke, the louder the laughter of the girls would get. With Trish's story, the other girls felt proud of their masters. It was not considered a shameful act if their masters were engaged in sexual intercourse with them. Rather, they felt honored. After listening to everything Trish had to say, a bamboo slip with Zen's name engraved on it appeared in the woman's hand. Without hesitation, she slipped it into the poor pot. That was the first slip of the night that was rated so low. At the same time, a look of grimace was smeared across the face of the woman. Her smile disappeared as she scowled at Trish. "In the Flow Sword sect, only the masters are allowed to do whatever they want. If your master can't get rid of his obsession with cultivation, then you will be punished. I don't want to see your master be rated as poor again next time. Do you hear me?" Trish felt her soul leave her body when she saw the bamboo slip getting placed in the poor pot. Mocking gazes from the other girls felt like swords stabbing her from all directions. Subconsciously she covered her face in shame and felt her cheeks burn. "You can leave now." The woman ordered someone to put away the pots, and gestured the girls to leave. After the woman went with her group, the girls followed and left the palace too. They quickly formed groups and began whispering and gossiping amongst each other. Trish walked like an outsider among the crowd with heavy steps and felt lightheaded. One girl came up to her and said, "Fortunately, we don't need to take an examination this month. There's something wrong with the flow tower. After it is repaired, you have to be careful. If your master is expelled from the flow sword sect, you will also be expelled as his maid." The girl's words seemed to be caring, but actually, she was ridiculing Trish. "I know that," Trish said with low spirits as she kept her head hung loose. She returned to Zen's courtyard and met with Carrie. Standing there, Carrie read her expressions and guessed the result. Good, fair, poor, oh my goodness. After a long period of silence, Carrie asked in a concerned tone, "What should we do now?" "We have to figure out a way," said Trish sternly. "What way? Tell me, I'm all ears," Carrie asked. "A way to make Mr. Luo give up cultivation," said Trish. Chapter 2726, The Sword Texture Technique. Trish had an idea of how persistent the warriors who had reached the other shore were. Maybe someone like Zen was not suitable to stay in the flow sword sect. Similar to Zen, there were people in the past who made the wrong choice and were later dismissed. Even if Zen was asked to leave, he had other options to choose from. He could either move to the Killing Sword sect or the Unique Array Sword sect. Compared to him, Trish and Carrie would have to face grave consequences. They would be asked to leave the mountain, and wouldn't be allowed to stay in the flow sword sect. If other servant girls were in the same position as them, they might just give up their jobs and leave. However, Carrie only widened her eyes and asked, "So how do we stop Mr. Luo from cultivating? When he sets up an enchanted barrier, we won't be able to enter his room." "We should figure out a way," said Trish while nodding her head. The second day, it was a bright and sunny morning. White fluffy clouds that looked like cotton candy drifted across the sky. Inside one of the rooms on the upper floor of the building, there was a wooden slab cut out in the shape of a square, a stone brick, and a long sword in front of Zen. The textures of everything in the world exist. One can't see them all because they do not observe them carefully enough. Theoretically speaking, even I can find the textures on the whole source world when I reach the top level of the sword texture technique. I should be able to chop the source world in half and destroy it with one sword strike. In the past few days, Zen had developed a deep understanding of the sword texture technique and gradually become familiar with it. However, he was at a loss for words when he read the postscript of the sword texture technique. It was a bit of a stretch to describe that one could cut open the source world in half with one sword strike. I should disperse the truth aura, and hold my breath while I observe it. Casually, Zen began to release his truth aura, and it slowly surrounded him from all sides. When the truth aura started dispersing to a certain extent, he gathered it by following the methods of the sword texture technique and pushed it towards the square wood in front of him. Then he kept his eyes wide open and stared at the slab of wood. Soon, he witnessed a texture form on the surface of it. "Can I break it if I cut it along its texture?" Instinctively, Zen picked up the long sword and proceeded to cut along the texture on the surface of the wood. Swish! With a swift move, the slab got cut in half. Looking at the broken symmetrical pieces of the wood, Zen pursed his lips in disappointment. He could easily slice the wooden slab into two pieces with even his soul power, let alone a sword. The sword texture technique seemed to be so formidable. However, the result still disappointed Zen. With the amount of effort he put in, he expected more. But, soon after, when the square wood fell to the ground, something amazing happened. The surface of both pieces appeared to have many broken lines on them. Crack, crack, crack. The two pieces of wood Zen split earlier further crumbled down into many minuscule bits until they were reduced to dust. Watching this scene, Zen couldn't help but feel stunned. With only one strike, he had subdued a sturdy slab of wood and turned it into powder. Feeling inspired, he now switched his attention to the stone brick. Once again, he released his aura. Carefully, he ran his gaze on the complicated textures of the stone brick. He sought out 3 different textures that gathered at one place to form a dot. This time, he wanted to be creative. With a swift wave of his hand, he threw the sword aside. And instead, he poked at the dot using his finger. Making sure he didn't break the stone brick, he tapped it gently. However, just as his finger made contact with the area, the sound of a crack resounded in the room. As a result, the stone brick had crumbled to dust. Sure enough, even more enthusiastic than before, Zen turned his concentration to the last object. This long sword had been brought from the divine land. Although it was not as good as the primary profound blood treasure, its quality was not something to be underestimated. Applying the same method as before, Zen stared at the object and could feel that his aura surrounded it. However, this time, he was unable to detect any textures on the sword. After all, the sword texture technique was a supreme swordsmanship manual, it was impossible to master it in one go. But still, Zen was a persistent man, and he continued to gaze at it long and hard. Simultaneously, he kept releasing his truth aura, but he could only vaguely make out the textures on the sword. As I have expected, it's really difficult to detect the sword textures with the naked eye. This was partly the reason why Zen gave up learning the sword texture technique before. The technique was so complicated that it was hard for him to make out the textures of his opponents who were on the same cultivation level as him. At this point, it could be counted as useless theurgy, which could only be used to deal with ordinary things. However, he had picked it up again because this time, he had the eye of will to rely on. He raised his right eyebrow, and a ray of white light began to flash across his pupil. It was as if the world around him had changed. Anything he laid his right eye on seemed to be as clear as crystal. The sword textures that once seemed blur to him were now as clear as day. There, in the middle of the blade, Zen stretched out his hand and sliced at the middle of the sword with his finger. Not wanting to exert much pressure, he gently tapped at it. Even so, the middle part of the sword immediately disintegrated into tiny particles of metal, and the hilt had turned into a pile of wood chips. Subconsciously his eyes widened at the sight as he imagined the damage this technique could do to a living creature. Just as Zen was about to consolidate his skill, the enchanted barrier he placed suddenly let out a clap of thunder. A figure bounced off from the impact, and at the same time, he heard a miserable scream of a woman. Taken by surprise, Zen hurriedly waved his hands to remove the enchanted barrier. As he turned his gaze towards the woman, he saw Trish lying on the ground. "Didn't I tell you to not enter my room without my permission?" Zen said as he shook his head in disappointment. Trish was slightly injured after she ricocheted from getting in contact with it. Wearing light makeup, she took advantage of the moment and deliberately lifted the hemline of her dress. She looked pitiful as she exposed her legs to him in an attempt to seduce him. However, Zen just ignored that. Instead, he helped her recover from her wounds. As he flicked his fingers, a ray of green light began to cloak her, and the internal momentum of the life-godly way healed her. Just as Zen turned around to go back to his cultivation, Trish said, "I thought since you cultivated every day, you should get some nourishment to replenish your energy, so I cooked some soup for you. Now it seems that I may have to bring another jar of soup for you." The jar of soup now was on the ground with all its contents spilled over, making the fragrance of soup diffuse around the room. Looking at the soup jar, Zen just shook his head and said, "That's fine. You don't have to. I haven't eaten food for many years." But, before Trish could finish, Zen had already returned to his cultivation. With a wave of his hands, the enchanted barrier enveloped the room once more. Trish stomped her foot to the ground and left with a sullen expression on her face. "Trish, how did it go?" Carrie couldn't help but ask, even though she had guessed what had happened upon seeing Trish's expression. "He is such an aloof guy. Unfortunately, we can't explain anything to him," Trish said as she gritted her teeth. This was the rule of the Flow Sword sect. The servant girls were not allowed to tell others about the secrets of the Flow Tower. Once the Flow Tower is repaired, and Mr. Luo is unable to pass the test, I'm afraid we will immediately be asked to leave as well. "We only have a month left," Carrie said with low spirits. "I will not give up," Trish said while clenching her fists furiously. In the next few days, Trish and Carrie made several attempts to stop Zen from cultivating. One day, Carrie had carried her zither to the second floor where he was training. She was proficient in music. But when she played it, Zen had cast a soundproof enchanted barrier to isolate the sound. Another day, when Zen came out of his room, Trish asked him to take a look at her painting and give her feedback. But Zen turned her down with the excuse that he was not an expert when it came to paintings. And one day, in the eyes of Trish and Carrie, Zen was a warrior who only focused on his cultivation and never cared for much else. He was not suitable to stay in the Flow Sword sect. Chapter 2727, The Flow Tower. Even though nagging was against Trish's nature, she still felt frustrated that Zen wouldn't give her any attention. After a few days, came the news about the restoration of the Flow Tower. As a result, Trish was in despair. The bell rang again, signaling the arrival of a new month. But this time, Zen was indifferent and didn't pay much attention to it. Zen had no idea how the Flow Sword sect operated, so he just decided to seize the chance to cultivate by himself. He planned on perfecting the sword texture technique and then heading back to the other shore. However, as night struck, it was time for the assessment of the servant girls again. Like last time, Trish hung her head in defeat and went to the palace with the other girls. And just like before, she answered all her questions truthfully and then watched Zen's bamboo slip get thrown into the pot. The flow tower has been repaired. The disciples of the flow sword sect will go in there for their training tomorrow. When your master fails, you can leave by yourself. The gorgeous woman spoke to Trish with a stern look. The other girls all looked at Trish with sympathetic eyes as she kept her gaze fixated on the ground in shame. To be expelled from the flow sword sect was probably the most humiliating thing for these servant girls. After those events, Trish returned to the building with a defeated expression on her face. Studying her gloomy profile, Carrie understood what had happened, and she even mentally prepared herself to leave soon. Tell Mr. Luo that the flow tower will be open tomorrow, Trish said with low spirits. Maybe it's better for you to tell him in person, Carrie suggested while rubbing her shoulders to console her. I don't want to talk to him. Trish held Zen responsible for all the humiliation she had to face. Blinded by anger, Trish refused to interact with him. Understanding her predicament, Carrie sighed helplessly and went upstairs to pass the message to Zen instead. Flow tower. Of course, Zen didn't expect things to continue like this forever. They wouldn't be giving out those entry tokens for nothing. However, he still wondered why the flow sword sect would operate like this. On the next day, Trish was nowhere to be seen. Please follow me. Carrie bowed slightly towards Zen. Trish was so depressed that she chose to not come out that day, so Carrie had to take over and escort him instead. Zen followed Carrie out of the door. As if on cue, the other doors opened one after the other as well. The servant girls continued to lead their respective disciples of the flow sword sect through the alleys. These disciples were all highly cultivated, with most of them having reached the 6th stage of the other shore realm. They gave Zen occasional sideways glances that were filled with contempt. As they headed towards the sword tower, the servant girls immediately recognized Carrie in the crowd. They connected the dots and concluded that Zen was the master entrusted to her and Trish. Upon seeing her with him, most of them began to silently whisper to their young masters. That guy is Zen Luo, he has been rated as poor for 2 months in a row. In the past, when someone was rated as poor, they would get expelled after the assessment in the flow tower next day. This time with the flow tower damaged, he's been rated as poor for 2 months consecutively without getting dismissed. It has never happened before. What a shame, Trish is still going to be expelled despite her efforts. Although the servant girls only whispered among themselves, Zen still could make out what they were saying. He didn't care much about the taunts directed towards him, but he turned to ask Carrie with a concerned tone, "Are you getting into trouble because of me?" Carrie was tempted to nod so bad, but she controlled her emotions and shook her head. "No, it's your choice, we cannot interfere with it." Sensing her unspoken feelings, Zen nodded to himself and gave her a confident smile. "I won't let you down." "Yes, you will." She wanted to refute his claims, but instead, kept it in her heart. Following the swarm of people, they had passed through many palaces and buildings. After the long stroll, a tall tower filled Zen's field of vision as it mounted over him. The tower's shape resembled that of a gourd, except it had 19 floors. And on each floor, there was a door leading inside it. The tower was surrounded by a dozen buildings. The buildings looked similar to the one he spent his days in. But he had no idea who lived in them. As Zen shortened the distance between himself and the flow tower, he began to sense something strange coming from it. His mind refused to allow his body to move any further until he had determined what that was. The anxiety and restlessness flooded his thoughts. In hopes that others had felt the same thing he did, he began to scan the expressions of the other disciples. But they seemed unbothered and didn't appear to have observed a thing. Seeing Zen's baffled reaction to the tower, Carrie sighed deeply within. The disciples of the flow sword sect were able to come up the mountain, which meant that they were all highly cultivated. The side effects of the extreme feelings triggered by the flow tower were very dreadful. Before entering the tower, one had to release all their desires and obsessions. Greed, wrath, lust, pleasure, pride, envy, gluttony. One should rid themselves of every passion, and it was consequential for them to satisfy all their desires before they could think of entering the flow tower. Of course, not all desires could be satisfied. For example, some people wished to obtain a premium other shore treasure, but they simply couldn't because they lacked divine crystals. That type of desire wouldn't be satisfied. Everyone knew that the flow sword sect would never really offer them any premium other shore treasure. It was unrealistic, to begin with. A building to cultivate and 2 servant girls were all that they could arrange. Practicing great self-control and suppressing inner inhibitions was a unique form of cultivation required by the flow tower. When the disciples gathered, Zen scanned their faces as if to look for someone. He was searching for Milo. Zen knew Milo was in the flow sword sect, and that sooner or later he would come face to face with him. But as hard as he looked, he couldn't see him anywhere. For some reason, he still glanced around and desperately yearned to see his face. In the past, he wouldn't feel so uneasy over encountering him, even though he cared a lot about confronting Milo. After searching unsuccessfully for a while, Zen finally realized he was under the influence of the tower. I must have underestimated the tower, Zen thought to himself. As time passed by, about a dozen more disciples gathered outside the flow tower. The gorgeous woman waved her hand, and a row of golden lot pots emerged in front of her. Every disciple of our sect will be given 10 entry tokens every year. That gives everyone 20 hours in the tower each year. You can tell that every chance to enter the tower is extremely precious. I hope that you make the best use of it. For those newcomers entering the tower today, anyone who can't make it through the second floor will be expelled immediately. The entry tokens will be divided by others. Anyone who could reach the 7th floor will be offered another building and an extra 100 entry tokens every year. She was obviously referring to people in a similar position as Zen. As she explained the rules, it became clear that the buildings surrounding the tower were for the use of the elite disciples. She finished speaking and drew a bamboo slip from the golden pot labeled as excellent. Damien Zhu, you may proceed into the tower. Hearing that, a young man with light-colored skin stretched himself and casually walked towards the flow tower. Then, she went on to draw another slip from the same pot and announced the name. The one who got called went inside the tower as well. One after the other, she sent 10 people in, and then she stopped drawing the slips. Chapter 2728, the last one. Staying in the flow tower for less than 2 hours would still be considered 2 hours spent. Warriors who entered the tower would seize every minute, maximizing every second. Even if they couldn't make it to the higher floors of the flow tower, they wouldn't leave within 2 hours. After all, one could only stay in the tower for 20 hours a year. As the crowd waited in silence, Trish appeared suddenly. She frowned as she searched the crowd for Zen. She knew he had done poorly, but she had to see the result herself. When she finally spotted Zen and Carrie, she headed towards them dejectedly. I'm sorry, Mr. Luo. You've been rated as poor. I'm afraid you will be the last one to enter the tower. Zen shrugged. They all turned towards the tower. Once the first batches of warriors entered, several golden dots lit up on the rough surface of the bricks and mortar that made up the tower walls. The golden dots seemed to hover on the first floor for a while, but soon they quickly climbed up to the second floor. How fast they are, cried someone from the crowd. They are excellent, Trish sighed, eyeing the golden light dots. But unfortunately I don't have the luck to be their maid. The crowd eagerly watched as the golden dots moved along the walls of the tower. That way, they could follow the movements of the warriors inside. The first group of people were rated as excellent. They had been trained well, and they moved through the tower like a fish in water. The glamorous woman watched the moving dots of golden light with a satisfied look on her face. The flow tower stopped working for 2 months. I'm pleased that this hasn't hindered anyone, as all the disciples have still made great progress, a person beside the glamorous woman said expressionlessly. I wonder if anyone will reach the 7th floor. Damien reached the 6th floor last time. If he makes it to the 7th floor this time, he will be qualified to move, another person said excitedly. Everyone hoped that someone would move into one of the independent courtyard houses. However, in the past year, no one in the flow sword sect had gotten far enough to be qualified. The golden dots darted aggressively along the wall of the flow tower. After a few seconds, around 8 dots had jumped to the 3rd floor. A voice chirped from the crowd, such incredible speed. Minutes later, 10 dots stopped on the 5th floor. The 5th floor of the flow tower is very crucial. Look, my master is summoning his power on this floor. Maybe he can reach the 7th floor in one go. Quit dreaming, we all know it's not that easy. The maids of the 10 disciples fidgeted nervously, chattering amongst themselves anxiously. If their masters managed to make it to the 7th floor, they would definitely be treated better. In addition, their status would be promoted accordingly in the flow sword sect. It could be said that all the maids and their masters had shared weal and woe. Although they could not help much in the flow tower, they were able to help in all other aspects. The maids watched fervently, silently cheering their masters on. The 10 golden light spots hovered on the 5th floor for another few minutes before they began to move again, albeit at a bit slower pace than before. While the maids couldn't see what was happening inside the tower wall, they could tell their masters were jumping inside. After a short while, a single light dot shot to the 6th floor. "It must be my master," a girl dressed in white exclaimed in glee, her eyes sparkling. The other maids saw the light dot and muttered under their breaths, unable to conceal their jealousy. Damien Zhu was the best among all the disciples, and was most likely going to reach the 7th floor. 2 months prior, he had come quite close, but in the end, he had left with deep regret. As for the other 9 dots of golden light, the maids could tell their masters were still struggling on the 5th floor. From the looks of it, it was very difficult for them to reach the 6th floor. The clock was ticking. The maids exchanged nervous glances. Time was almost up. The girl in white grew more and more nervous, her ponytails bobbing anxiously. Success or failure hinged on her master. Just as she felt she were going to explode from the stress, the single golden dot suddenly rushed upward. Buzz. As expected, the golden light dot had really made it to the 7th floor. Normally, after a disciple reached a certain floor, they would have a rest there if they had enough time. After all, time in the flow tower was too precious. However, the disciple probably could not bear the pressure of the 7th floor. The moment he reached the 7th floor, he broke the door open and flew out. Mr. Zhu, Mr. Zhu, the girl with 2 ponytails shouted excitedly as she rushed towards the disciple. But she suddenly stopped halfway, disappointment and confusion written all over her face. 2 other maids squealed excitedly, "Mr. Li, it's Mr. Li," they chanted as they congratulated their master, Imran Li, who made it to the 7th floor. The girl with the ponytail struggled to keep her composure as her lips trembled slightly. At the last minute, 3 more dots of golden light made it to the 6th floor of the flow tower, one of whom was Damien. The 6th and 7th floors were quite different. Finally, 2 hours had passed. The 3 warriors, including Damien, opened the 6th floor door and emerged gloomily. The other 6 warriors emerged from the 5th floor, looking just as unhappy. These people had been training to reach the 7th floor. It was just such a pity that they couldn't reach it. After the 10 warriors left the flow tower and headed towards their maids, the woman daintily announced the names of the next 10 who were to enter the tower. The strength of the second group was obviously inferior to that of the first group. Their climbing speed was slower, and only one made it as far as the 6th floor. The others reached the 4th and 5th floors only. The other groups followed, with just as disappointing results. Zen looked around him, noticing the disciples who had finished their time in the tower were still there. "What are these people waiting for?" Zen asked Carrie curiously. Carrie turned to look at the people Zen was talking about. With a smile, she said in an amused tone, "They are waiting for you to enter the flow tower." "Me? Why?" Zen was stunned. "Well, you are a new disciple, so it's very likely that you won't make it even to the 2nd floor." She smiled mischievously, pausing for a dramatic effect. "That means you'll be expelled from the flow sword sect. Then, they will try to snatch your 9 entry tokens. The more entry tokens they obtained, the more times they could enter the flow tower. No one wanted to miss this opportunity." "Oh, I see," Zen shrugged as he realized that these people were just waiting for him to fail. Many more groups entered the flow tower, but the quality of the matches kept deteriorating. However, not a single one was trapped on the 1st floor. Even the new disciples, who had joined the flow sword sect at the same time as Zen, had made it to the 2nd floor. No one was expelled from the flow sword sect. The disciples who had left the tower earlier threw dagger looks at no one in particular, as they were incredibly disappointed that no entry tokens were to be claimed. Everyone got up to prepare to leave. At this time, the glamorous woman cleared her throat. "There is one last warrior who has yet to enter the flow tower." Picking up the slip with Zen's name from the core pot, she continued, "This disciple named Zen Luo has been rated as core for consecutive 2 months. This rarely happens. Now, it's his turn to enter the flow tower." Usually, 10 disciples entered the flow tower at the same time as a group. But in this case, Zen was the last one left. Hearing what the coquettish woman said, the disappointed disciples instantly cheered up. There was no way this warrior would make it past the 1st floor. Chapter 2729, The Flame of Soul. No one has ever received a core evaluation for 2 consecutive months, right? A man with such a personality is not suitable to stay in the flow sword sect. If he is expelled, I'll have a chance of obtaining an entry token. Those who were about to leave turned around to watch what was going to happen to Zen. Since they didn't know him, they began to inquire of their respective servant girls about him. The master served by Trish and Carrie. I heard he had been cultivating in seclusion ever since he came to the Flow Sword sect. Maybe he is too stubborn to know how to love a woman. The women spoke without fear because they had the support of their masters. They continued to spite Zen with a look of disdain on their faces. It was not hard to relate to their emotions. As servants, their purpose was to serve and please their masters. But Zen had completely broken the rules and denied them of their mission, which rendered Carrie's and Trish's existences meaningless. Zen listened to all judgments that were being passed on him and continued to diffuse them. Then suddenly, a sharp voice from the back of the crowd resounded in the place. "What are you talking about? Mr. Luo is not the kind of person you are portraying him to be." The crisp voice belonged to Trish. Although Zen was about to be expelled from the mountain along with her and Carrie, she felt the need to protect him against these allegations. In her eyes, he was a righteous man who did not deserve the heat from all the girls. Well, you're going to be kicked out soon, and you still argue for him. Trish, you really do stand up for your master, huh? Poor Trish, you tried your best, but all your efforts were in vain. Quote, the women continued to brutally taunt her with their barbed words. The disciples watched from the sidelines as they felt the women should sort their issues out among themselves. As for Zen, since he was new, they didn't take him seriously. But now all their attention was directed at Zen since they anticipated his dismissal would happen soon. Getting a poor evaluation for 2 months in a row meant there was a high probability of him being expelled. Preparing herself to retaliate, Trish bit her lip anxiously. But then Zen gestured her to stop and said, "Don't mind them." "But Mr. Luo," Trish insisted, "I will promise you one thing. I won't be expelled by the Flow Sword sect, and you won't have to leave the mountain either." Zen interrupted her with a confident smile. After hearing his kind words, the two girls were at a loss for words. Carrie's eyes widened, and Trish stood in utter disbelief. "Just do whatever you can, Mr. Luo. I have nothing else to ask of you," Trish added as she felt moved by his words. "Yes, do what you can, Mr. Luo." Carrie encouraged him while punching the air excitedly. The glamorous woman watched all this unravel with curiosity, and then she gestured Zen to enter the tower. With an assuring nod to the two girls, he made his way inside the Flow Tower. While waiting, Zen had a lot of time to reflect on things from the past. When he fought against Fergus, he felt a strange sensation in his swordsmanship theurgy. This feeling was strikingly similar to that of the emotion-closing godly way. Since then, Zen had made up his mind that he would go to the Flow Sword sect. The flow strike piqued his interest. He also managed to deduce something else. That day when he met Athamar at the mountain viewing province, he seemed to be lecherous. Zen couldn't help but feel appalled by his actions as he didn't seem to keep his hands to himself from Elizabeth. Zen had expected him to show some decency as an elder. It turned out that Athamar was probably another master from the Flow Sword sect. This explained his actions from that day. Since Zen came up to the mountain, Athamar hadn't shown up. But given his previous attitude, he should have known that Zen had chosen the Flow Sword sect. Him failing to show up meant he had complete faith in Zen that he would be successful in challenging the Flow Tower. Zen felt stirred in him as he shortened the distance between himself and the tower. Skillfully, he suppressed his emotions and strode into the Flow Tower. Bang! The door of the Flow Tower slammed shut behind him. Compared to the outside, the tower was not that big on the inside, and he felt no magic array surrounding him either. There was one exquisite thing in the tower that caught his attention. In the center of the room there was a pillar, which appeared to have flames surrounding it. The menacing flames danced on all sides of the pillar and diffused in the air, causing the temperature to rise to a notable degree inside the Flow Tower. But for Zen, the temperature was barely noticeable since he was immune to all kinds of flames. Just as Zen was about to move forward, a voice coming from inside the Flow Tower stopped him in his tracks. "Show me your entry token." Zen tapped the space ring lightly and took out a golden square token in his hand. Swish, swish, the golden square token seemed to be made of ice and it melted under the high temperature of the Flow Tower. "You can stay at the first floor for now. But you can also use your strength and ability to climb up." The voice seemed to know that Zen was a newcomer to the Flow Tower. Politely, it instructed him on what he had to do to progress further. As soon as the voice disappeared, the surface of the pillar began to glow with a blinking red light. There were wild flares of fire coming out from it. Hot, it's too hot. Suddenly, Zen felt the temperature in his body rise up to an alarming degree as his chest began to boil up. The heat of the flames did not frighten him. Even if the entire Flow Tower was cloaked in the fire, it would not get in his way. But something was different this time. As he lifted his feet to continue ahead, they were burdened by the weight of his body and the pain in his chest. Strong emotions now flooded his thoughts as he tried to ignore them. The more steps he took, the more overwhelming the pain got for him. His mind was now a mixture of all his concealed emotions welling up inside of him and affecting his mood. Anxiety, failure, fear, greed, desire. Everyone harbored these negative emotions, but they all kept them buried in a deep corner of their existence. If a strong-willed person was able to dispose of them, so could Zen. But even if somehow he was successful in compressing them, their presences could not be denied. Within the flow tower, all his emotions were ignited by the restless flame. Tenacious as he was, he refused to give up. But every time he forced himself to progress, the pain grew gradually. Suddenly, Zen felt a sharp sting in his chest when a bright red flame began burning from within it. The flame of soul can devour one's heart and mind. Young man, the stronger your obsession is, the stronger the counterattack of the flame of soul is. If you can't endure it, you can leave by yourself. The voice in the flow tower echoed again. The flame of soul, her words made him stop in his tracks. Zen clenched his chest as he bore the pain. As he felt his chest where the fire was with his hand, the red flame did not burn it. The temperature of the fire was normal, but the pain he was experiencing was no illusion. It was real. If I could just climb up to the second floor. Zen raised his head in agony and looked up. Yet, there was no staircase up to the second floor in the flow tower. It appeared the only way was to leap towards it. Making his mind up, he stomped his feet on the ground and flew up. However, the moment Zen jumped up, the red flame of soul in his chest abruptly swelled up, like a giant silk cocoon, enwrapping him. The pain it caused was multiplied over 100 times. The unbearable pain mixed with all the negative emotions made it hard for him to focus. When a myriad of negative emotions broke out, he sensed that he was orphaned and shunned by the world, making him feel more worthless than ever. Plop, he just jumped 5 feet high and then planted face first on the ground. Outside the flow tower, everyone saw the golden light spot on the surface of the tower jump once and return to where it was. Chapter 2730, Thirgy Beyond Emotion Closing Godly Way. The disciples waiting outside the flow tower watched the golden dot of light struggle, a satisfied smile playing at their lips. After all, Zen was a disciple of the same sect as them, it was improper for them to openly jeer at him. Naturally, they hoped Zen would fail. Seeing the wobbly golden dot hinted to failure excited them. On the other hand, those women in white had no scruples about speaking their mind. He has been rated core for 2 consecutive months. He deserves it. Do you see how he's struggling on the first floor? There's no way he'll last. Just you wait, he'll come out when he can't hold on any longer. I'm betting it'll take 5 minutes, at most. They all shot hateful glances at Trish and Carrie as they spoke. I'm afraid that Mr. Luo won't make it, Carrie said, her voice trembling slightly. As long as he tries his best, it doesn't matter how this will end, Trish said reassuringly as she watched the golden dot on the wall of the tower. What matters is he doesn't give up, he's still trying his best to jump onto the second floor. Oh, Trish, you are so good at finding excuses to console yourself, a woman in white beside Trish said haughtily. Remember how he promised to you before he entered the tower. Look at him now, he's so lame. She threw her head back and laughed. Trish glared at the girl in white. The woman who was laughing was Winnie Sue. She was good at making people feel bad. Usually Trish didn't take things to heart. Nevertheless, Winnie Sue insisted on creating drama. Time is not up yet. Our master still has the chance to succeed, said Trish calmly. Chance, ha ha ha, Winnie Sue could only laugh at Trish's naivete. Anyone who watched keenly could tell that a weak warrior like Zen barely had the chance of turning the situation around. Trish was definitely aware of this, but she was reluctant to admit it. Zen was her master, after all. Time ticked by. These people had been by the tower for more than 20 hours, yet surprisingly, they waited patiently. Zen, on the other hand, was still at the bottom of the flow tower, motionless. The flame of soul, it's not a real flame. It should be a kind of energy. As Zen grew stronger, he now had a better understanding of how this world worked. Any matter in the world was created with energy. The sea water of the sea of truth, the other shore power, the internal momentum and life vitality, they were all different kinds of energy. And the self that formed in the soul was the ruler that controlled the energy. This kind of flame can affect people's emotions. I feel pain because my emotions are affected, Zen pondered as he lowered his head. In this case, if I use the emotion-closing godly way, could I avoid being affected by the flame of soul? Zen's eyes flashed as he began to channel his energy. The internal momentum of the emotion-closing godly way was a kind of special energy, and, as its name implied, it could also affect one's emotions. The internal momentum of the Great Dominance technique had the same function. The difference was that the emotion-closing godly way was targeted at the cultivators themselves, whereas the Great Dominance technique was targeted at others. Emotion closing. As he was gathering the internal momentum, his eyes gradually turned cold and merciless. All the things in the world seemed to fall away from him. Only his self-consciousness was left. Inside the flow tower, there was no more sadness, joy, hatred, nor pain. The red flame of soul collected itself until it formed a face. Here comes another guy practicing the emotion-closing godly way, it said amusedly. Red flames that made up its eyebrows raised in surprise. The division of the godly ways varied in the source world. Some forces divided the godly ways into over 2,700 kinds, and some divided them into over 2,900 kinds. Different forces divided them in different ways. However, very few people in the divine land and the source world chose to practice the emotion-closing godly way. On the one hand, the emotion-closing godly way was extremely difficult to cultivate. On the other hand, it was difficult to reach consummation of this godly way. Actually, Zen had relied on Fuxi's help to improve his cultivation of the emotion-closing godly way to its consummation. Moreover, the cultivators in the source world all aimed at reaching the other shore. When one could choose the 5 elements godly way, which was much easier to cultivate, who in their right mind would consider the more difficult and troublesome emotion-closing godly way? The face formed by the flame of soul had originally intended to suggest Zen leave the tower, but now he was a little curious about him. Be warned. The emotion-closing godly way isn't as omnipotent as you think. Whether you can comprehend its profoundness will depend on your understanding. After Zen used the emotion-closing godly way to cut off his emotions, he looked upwards. For the second time, he jumped. Instantly, he felt the flame of soul blaze in his chest. Zen felt his negative emotions surging, however, at the same time, he felt them being blocked and almost contained. The emotion-closing godly way acted like an enchanted barrier, completely blocking out the negative emotions. I made it. It's so easy. Zen remained calm. If he wasn't in the state of emotion closing, he'd have probably jumped with joy by now. However, the flame of soul did not extinguish. As Zen jumped up, he felt the flame growing more and more intense. Just as he was about to step onto the second floor, the flames collectively shot straight to the spot between his eyebrows as though they were possessed. Bang! Zen felt a blow to his head and his vision blacked out. Once again, he fell to the ground. The emotion-closing godly way was said to have the ability to cut off all the emotions. But in fact, it only acted as a barrier that kept all his emotions out, leaving him with only his rational consciousness. The Great Dominance technique worked in the same way. It blocked the opponent's self-consciousness and replaced it with the user's own self-consciousness. This way, the user could manipulate their foe like a puppet master with their puppet. But just because the self-consciousness was blocked, it didn't mean that it didn't exist. Zen's obsession was strong, so the backlash he suffered was powerful. The flame of soul had gathered together and all attacked one point, making it possible to break through the barrier, coming straight at Zen's soul. To be honest, the warriors who practice emotion-closing godly way are indeed suitable for joining the Flow Sword sect. But it's a pity your obsession is too strong. Also, the way you use the emotion-closing godly way is a bit rough, haha. The face that was formed by the flame of soul spoke once again, jeering at Zen. Rough. Zen had already reached the consummation of emotion-closing godly way, yet his method of using it was regarded as rough. Naturally, he couldn't let this slide. However, reflecting upon how the flame of soul attacked him just now, he realized something. In the past, Zen just used the emotion-closing godly way as a way of attack, and he hoped that it would become his most powerful swordsmanship. But he needed to consider that the source world was different. The godly ways had evolved here for a long time and the methods of using them were more diversified. For example, just now, Zen could have used the emotion-closing godly way to avoid the flame of soul from attacking one point on him. As Zen pondered over this, he gathered his wits and sat cross-legged on the ground. The emotion-closing godly way he learned did not teach him such a method, so he could only explore it by himself. There were so many thirties beyond ways in the divine land, which were also figured out by those true gods themselves, and Zen thought he could also explore and figure out a thirty beyond emotion-closing godly way himself. From outside the tower, the people counted the minutes. 5 minutes had passed. 10 minutes had passed. 15 minutes had passed. Finally, an hour had passed quickly. The people began to grow restless. He just tried twice, and failed twice. Now, he won't even move. What a coward. He might be questioning the meaning of his life at the bottom of the tower. It doesn't matter what he is doing. Time is almost up. As the women were whispering amongst themselves, the door of one of the courtyard houses behind the flow tower quietly creaked open. A young man in a quora raincoat, with a beautiful girl in his arms, slowly walked towards the tower. Chapter 2731, Moving Up the Flow Tower. Everyone gradually got bored from staring at the motionless golden light dot in the flow tower. Thus the arrival of the young man in a quora raincoat and the girl in yellow drew their attention towards them. That's Milo. He came out today. He's the most powerful warrior of the flow sword sect. It is known that he is capable of instant enlightenment, and can produce the sword-reading liquid as much as he wants. The sword-reading liquid is exceedingly expensive. If he sells it, he could earn countless divine crystals. The girls in white were struck with awe as their gazes followed Milo. Geniuses were always treated with high regard by the girls. As for Damien and the other disciples of the flow sword sect, they felt inferior to him in his presence. Those who resided in the separate courtyard houses were this sect's elite disciples, and Milo was the best among them. Every year, the ordinary disciples were allowed to stay in the flow tower for 20 hours, while the elite were allowed 200 hours. However, Milo was the only exception who could stay in the tower as long as he wished. That was the highest privilege given to anyone in the flow sword sect. As for the girl walking alongside him, she had a respectful background in the Oneness Sky Palace. At the sight of Milo, the glamorous woman put on a seductive smile and asked, "What brings you here, Milo?" "It's too boring in the house," Milo replied, shrugging his shoulders casually. Then, his gaze fell on the flow tower, and he stared at it with a baffled expression on his face. Why is there only one person in the flow tower? And why is that person still on the first floor? This person has gotten poor for 2 months in a row. What's more, he is the last one of the newcomers. That's why there is only him in the flow tower, the glamorous woman explained. Is that so? Milo murmured, as he stopped walking. The person in the tower seemed to have captured Milo's interest. Milo, there's nothing interesting to watch here. Let's just go, the girl named Kate beside Milo grumbled in an annoyed voice. Hold on for a bit, I just want to see how long he can hold on. Having gotten poor in 2 consecutive months, he must be very agitated now. Entering the tower is bound to be a devastating experience for him. Milo said, gesturing her to stop. But, Kate still urged him to leave with her. Watching this, the glamorous woman said, he has stayed in the flow tower for more than an hour. I guess, within 10 minutes, he will be kicked out. Then we might as well wait until he comes out. We're in no hurry anyway, Milo uttered as he grabbed Kate's arm to signal her to stay put. Seeing the scene unfold from a distance, Carrie could not help but fantasize about standing beside Milo. She tugged at Trish's arm and whispered, "It would be such an honor if we got the chance to serve Mr. Mo." Trish shook her head and said, "The girl who can stand beside a man like Mr. Mo is by no means an ordinary person. That girl in yellow is not his maid. I heard that she is his fiancé, and that her father is a senior of the Oneness Sky Palace. We are worlds apart from her. I guess it is true that birth decides fate," Carrie sighed with a pout. "What a pity, Mr. Luo has been stuck in there for a long time. It seems that he won't be able to break through." Trish stared at the dot on the surface of the tower with low spirits. Trish was different from the other girls. She preferred being closer to reality compared to the others who had a habit of daydreaming. As time passed by, Zen's hopes of crossing the first floor slowly began to fade away. Another 5 minutes passed with no progress. People outside watched in anticipation. It now seemed more likely that Zen would soon be kicked out. Suddenly, Zen closed his eyes in an attempt to focus and lock all emotions out of his head. As he concentrated, he began to slowly dismantle the internal momentum of emotion closing godly way in his mind. In the situation he was now in, he viewed the emotion closing godly way in a different light as opposed to an offensive technique. He attempted to use it as a special soul theurgy, just like the way he thought of the Great Dominance technique. The most impressive point of the emotion closing godly way is to abandon all sorts of emotions and launch out a decisive sword attack. The flame of soul, however, can attack me at one point. Wait, when many negative thoughts are lingering in my mind, I can just cut them off. I get it now. Feeling enlightened, Zen suddenly opened his eyes in a flash. Now, let's go. With his mind made up, Zen jumped up enthusiastically once more. Whoosh! The moment he stepped off the ground to head to the second floor, the flame of soul reacted to his movements, and he felt the burning sensation in his chest again. Emotion closing. His eyes flashed a blinding light as he immediately used the emotion closing godly way. Just as Zen had predicted, the flame of soul reacted and gathered itself at one point and then made its way towards his forehead. It was this same move that had caused Zen to fail previously. However, this time he was prepared. The flame of soul was capable of attacking him at only one point in his body, and Zen was ready to defend it. When the flame of soul broke through the emotion-closing godly way and took advantage of Zen's obsession to entice his negative emotions, Zen focused all his internal momentum on a point. Buzz. A dangerous battle against conflicting emotions raged on within his body, but it only lasted for a few seconds. Then, one by one, all the extreme feelings triggered by the flames were slowly extinguished. Within a split second, Zen had successfully reached the second floor of the flow tower. What? The flame of soul manifested itself into a face again and had a shocked expression at the scene. Wow, you were so quick to comprehend the 3G beyond way to deal with me. Because of the existence of the other shore, the status of the godly ways in the source world wasn't very high, but a 3G beyond way was not something that could be easily comprehended. Moreover, Zen had to bear the pressure of the flame of soul in the flow tower. Showing no signs of hesitation, Zen leapt up again. Similar to the events that had occurred on the first floor, the flame of soul rose from Zen's chest once more and attempted to attack him at one point in his forehead. Emotion closing. He did not know what this 3G beyond way was called, but it was the only method he could use to dispose of the flame of soul. Buzz. As a white light flashed in his mind, the fire penetrated his mind again. However, those negative emotions, like restlessness, failure, and fear, were quickly diffused by the 3G. The third floor. Zen continued moving upwards. Meanwhile, outside the flow tower, the onlookers wore different expressions on their faces when they saw Zen jump up to the second floor. Mr. Luo. Mr. Luo reached the second floor. Carrie screamed as she jumped up and down on her toes, clapping her hands in excitement. I saw it, Trish replied in a solemn voice, staring at the round golden light dot. As long as Zen did not fall back to the first floor and walked out of the second floor door, he wouldn't be expelled. Naturally, Trish was a little worried, but suddenly, the golden light dot didn't fall. Instead, it continued to proceed to the third floor. That guy, he advanced to the third floor already in such a short time. How did he get so fast? The disciples of the Flow Sword sect all discussed among themselves as they watched the spectacle dumbfounded. It seemed that watching Zen was worth the wait after all. They never expected they would get to see him change course so quickly. Didn't you just say this person got the pour? Advancing so quickly from the first to the third floor, he by no means is an ordinary man, Milo said while giving an appealing smile. It had nothing to do with him, but he just watched for his entertainment. The glamorous woman and her companions were just stunned at the scene. He's still moving up, someone exclaimed while pointing in the tower's direction. The golden light dot on the surface of the flow tower leapt up again and reached the fourth floor without a hitch. Before anyone had the window to react, the golden light dot danced again and ended up on the fifth floor. The fifth floor? This guy is really something else. The disciples of the Flow Sword sect hung their heads in defeat. They realized that they wouldn't be able to get Zen's entry tokens, and it was still hard for them to accept the fact that he had jumped to the fifth floor at such a quick pace. Feeling defeated, they looked up to see the golden light dot had already made its way to the sixth floor and was now only one leap away from the seventh. Chapter 2732, That's him. Every disciple of the Flow Sword sect present held their breath as their pupils dilated at this sight. It was as if the cat got their tongues. None of them uttered a word, not even the servant girls. Instead, they all stared at the golden speck of light. Just how talented was he to reach the sixth floor on his first attempt? Trish and Carrie were rendered speechless. Excited, they had tears in their eyes. It made them look so radiant. Milo was watching intently as his face shifted. The expression of the girl standing next to him also switched. He's so obsessed with cultivation, yet he can still make it to the sixth floor. If I'm not wrong, then just like you, this man began with the emotion-closing godly way, Kate whispered to Milo as she kept her gaze fixated on the flow tower. I don't think so. I've heard that if one can control themselves with the soul-controlling godly way, they could also resist the flame of soul, Milo said curtly. The soul-controlling godly way was known as the Great Dominance technique in the Divine Land. To explain further, the users of the 3G beyond the soul-controlling godly way could create another consciousness. And thus, they were able to control themselves in mysterious ways. Although he seems promising, I'm afraid it's tough for him to break the record set by you, Kate said as the corners of her mouth curved into a smile. The spectacle of the man in the tower was stupefying. However, Milo still had the upper hand since he had jumped to the 8th floor when he first entered the tower. Both Milo and Kate were convinced that Zen was not up to par with Milo, at least not yet. However, as soon as Kate's voice fell, Zen had rushed to the 7th floor. The 6th and 7th floors posed as the most intricate barriers for the disciples. They would end up getting trapped in there in most cases. Therefore, the Flow Sword sect kept the ones who reached the 7th floor in high regard compared to others. Just when they began doubting whether Zen would advance any further, he had already reached the 7th floor. Meanwhile, in the Flow Tower, the flame of soul had turned into a shrieking blood-red color. The higher he moved, the more the flame of soul intensified. Even if he used the emotion-closing godly way, it would still prove insufficient in trying to completely get rid of the negative emotions that sprouted like an unwanted weed. But he still retained his feet steady and held on. By this moment, Zen had lost track of time and the count of the floor he was on. He only knew one thing: he had to keep moving forward till his legs gave up on him. If he even faced the slightest hesitation, those messy emotions would take over his heart and throw him into the abyss of pain. This kind of pain was unique. It was directed towards neither the soul nor flesh, but towards the heart. I must keep going, Zen roared in frustration and jumped up again. He has reached the 8th floor, Kate said, her throat now dry as she glanced at Milo. Milo refused to break his silence, but she still sensed the caution reflecting through his eyes. The guy who was able to ascend to the 8th floor in his first attempt at the Flow Tower was qualified to be Milo's opponent. Kate began to wonder who he was. If he was from the mountain, he couldn't be a nobody. Was he some sort of secret prodigy that was directly sent to the Flow Sword sect? Clatter. The long reigning silence was finally broken when Zen reached the 8th floor. Previously, when Zen made it to the 5th and 6th floors, everyone was shocked. But they still questioned whether his cultivation was sufficient enough for him to go further. Damien and Imran even went as far as to think Zen was on the same level as them. However, as Zen went on to reach the 7th and 8th floors, they subconsciously hung their heads in defeat, thinking they were inferior to him. Such a fellow was far more powerful than the likes of them. Therefore, at this moment, most people changed their minds. They were all eager to know which floor this guy would mark as his last. Can he reach the 9th floor? He has already tied with Milo's record. If he manages to break Milo's record, it will be much more interesting. Many curious heads turned to Milo to study his posture about the situation. They wanted to know what he was thinking. For them, it was a pipe dream to get on the same level as Milo. Therefore, they had hoped someone else could finally surpass him instead. But Milo remained calm and composed. He kept his gaze fixed at the Flow Tower. Then suddenly, the golden speck of light that had everyone's attention began to move again. It had jumped up and conquered the 9th floor as well. This is a new record, the glamorous woman exclaimed with excitement. Zen had made her eat her previous words to such a degree that she began to doubt the assessment system of the Flow Sword sect. It had given him a poor evaluation twice in a row, but his performance as of now was beyond anyone's expectation. Was the Flow Tower broken again? No, it couldn't be. It had just gotten repaired. Surprisingly, the golden light dot didn't seem to halt its movement after reaching the 9th floor. Meanwhile, inside the Flow Tower, Zen began to feel his body refuse the urge to go any further. It had reached its limit. The emotion-closing godly way was not omnipotent, even though it was the best way to resist the flame of soul. However, Zen's obsession was so strong that he was flooding with negative emotions welling up inside. They were like tentacles coiling around his entire body with a strenuous grip. The moment he moved up, the pressure of the flame of soul on the 10th floor doubled once again. After he reached the 7th floor, the flame of fire seemed to have acquired a strange ability that could make him have illusions. The illusions seemed so surreal that Zen was unable to tell whether they were fake or not. Time passed by slowly in the tower. A second felt like several months for him. During this time, he had seen so many dreadful illusions of the divine land being destroyed by an invisible dark hand, the tragic death of Jeffrey and Letitia, and the shattering of the fairy palace. Even if he figured out what he saw was not real, he still couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling from his mind. The magic was so strong that he felt pain from all those scenarios in his heart. Incredible. Chop. Zen knew that if he persisted for a little longer, he would sink into these wild illusions forever. With every fiber of his leftover spiritual power, he clenched his teeth and rushed to the 10th floor, knocking down the door of the Flow Tower. Bang! The door to the 10th floor was smashed open, and a man drenched in his own sweat collapsed right in front of it. Zen was drained from all his energy, and his skin was soaked as if he just came out of the water. However, the moment he left the flow tower, the flame of soul diminished into thin air. Everything went back to normal as he fell to his knees, exhausted. His eyes that once reflected fear and regret were now clear of all emotions. As if alerted by the door being opened, Milo and Kate desperately glanced in the direction of the man to make out his identity. When their eyes fell on the figure of interest, they were shocked to their very cores. Milo, that's him. Kate covered her mouth subconsciously as she gasped at the sight of Zen. Of all people, she should have been aware of his whereabouts. After all, she spent a lot of her time investigating Zen's background. It was not normal for a cultivator in the first stage of the other shore realm to defeat Fergus. However, Zen had disappeared for some time inexplicably after Milo had shamed him by cutting off his sword. Who would have thought that Zen would climb up the mountain in such a short period and join the Flow Sword sect? Chapter 2733, Can I bring my wives here? With casual steps, Milo approached Zen with a faint smile. He presented himself as calmly as possible with all his emotions in check. Nice to meet you again, he said, leaning forward with a smirk. Zen glanced at him with a sharp gaze. You still haven't compensated for my sword. You owe me 8 million divine crystals. Can't you let it go? I haven't sold any sword-reading liquid in the past few months. So you could earn lots of divine crystals, Milo said with his shoulders held back. Zen looked Milo directly in the eye and shrugged. I relied on my own ability to earn them, not you. In the past, Milo had warned Zen. But when he returned to the Flow Sword sect, someone also warned him. Only a handful of people from the palace were capable of making the sword-reading liquid. However, only Milo was given the privilege of selling there. Because of this opportunity, Milo had the chance to accumulate unbelievable amounts of divine crystals. But perhaps, it was now time for him to pass this privilege down to Zen, who had proven himself worthy of it. I can give you millions of divine crystals, Milo continued with arched eyebrows. But you will have to defeat me first. How long do you think that will take? Milo raised his eyebrows slightly, provoking Zen clearly. None of the disciples of Flow Sword sect could compete with Milo. In his many years residing in the Flow Sword sect, no disciple came close to even being able to threaten him. They were worlds apart in strength. In fact, there were only 2 or 3 disciples of the same generation as him in the whole Oneness Sky Palace who had talents on par with his. And now, the count had increased by 1 more. I'm in no such hurry, but I don't think it will take long. Zen tilted his head and raised his eyebrows. After hearing what Zen said, Milo nodded his head and scoffed. I'll wait for it, but I hope it won't take forever. Then he reached for Kate's hand and casually walked away. Did you hear that? This guy called Zen seems to be in conflict with Milo. This is not the point. The point is that he can make sword-reading liquid. It turns out that he is a talent of instant enlightenment. No wonder. Talented people are extraordinary wherever they are. The news from Milo came as more of a shock to them compared to Zen reaching the 10th floor of Flow Tower in his first attempt. After all, Flow Tower was just a test for the disciples of the Flow Sword sect, to see if they had ways of resisting the flame of soul. However, instant enlightenment was a standard. Talents that met with the standard were supposed to possess boundless potential in the future. There was a huge population in the entire palace, but there were only a few talents who had the capability of instant enlightenment since ancient times. Instant enlightenment, the glamorous woman suddenly realized it and had an annoyed look. Such a rare talent was hard to ignore for the palace, but none reminded her. As Zen approached Trish and Carrie, they couldn't conceal their excitement as they welcomed him with glistening eyes. Mr. Luo, remembering all the complaints and grudges she held in the past against Zen, Trish couldn't help but feel flustered. I promised that I wouldn't let you down, didn't I? Zen asked with a sweet smile. Of course, Carrie shook her head with teary eyes. Talents like you don't need to rest and release all emotions. I'm sorry that we were oblivious to this, Trish said, bowing respectfully. All right, let's go, Zen said as he gestured them to leave with him. As she watched them leave, the glamorous woman called out to them from behind. Wait. Zen turned around and looked at her. What is it? According to the rules of Flow Sword sect, you and Imran should move since you have reached the 7th floor of Flow Tower, the woman said in a very polite manner as she stared at Zen. Even though Zen was a newcomer, he had proven himself to be on the same level as Milo, maybe even surpassing him. Naturally, she would change her attitude towards him. Hearing this, an overjoyed Trish and Carrie exchanged glances between themselves. They were so excited to move that they almost accepted the offer on behalf of Zen, who stood there blankly. But Zen shook his head lightly and declined. No need. I think that house is good enough. Trish's and Carrie's jaws dropped to the floor in bewilderment. They had no words to describe Zen. This is not the way it should be. This is the rule of Flow Sword Sect. Please move, or you'll make things hard for me, the glamorous woman said gently, not taking no for an answer. After all, it was her duty to do this. In a dilemma, Zen curled his lips and looked at the girls. Their big bright eyes seemed to be saying, take it, move. Giving in to their needs, he waved his hands in defeat and said, all right. Let's go back to pack up. We'll move. Watching their backs as they left, the beautiful woman named Winnie couldn't help but feel a little jealous. Lost in her train of thoughts, she bit her lip so hard that it started bleeding. Recalling back to the time when she mocked Trish made her feel horrible as it all later blew up in her face when Zen proved everyone wrong. The other girls in white felt the same emotions as Winnie. They all stood baffled. Just 2 hours ago, they were all collectively sympathizing with Trish and Carrie, believing that they were going to be expelled from the mountain. But time changed its course so quickly that they couldn't comprehend what had just happened. After 2 hours, Trish and Carrie walked alongside Zen, who was now on par with Milo, making their way to their private courtyard house. The sudden change in their situation felt like heavy hammers raining down on their chest. Those courtyard houses were exquisite and lavish. Each house had 6 independent smaller ones and 3 yards within it. For the purpose of enunciating its splendor, it was decorated with pavilions and clear ponds. But warriors like Zen had no interest in lavish living conditions, they only needed a small room and isolation to cultivate in peace. A true god could build such a house in 4 to 6 hours in any scenic place they wished, but of course not at the top of Oneness Mountain. After exploring the courtyard house for a bit, Trish and Carrie followed close behind Zen. Since they had moved into a separate courtyard house and their wages had tripled, they were very grateful to Zen. For ordinary people, the reward of divine crystals was considerable enough. However, these women had other plans to show how grateful they were. Since Zen now understood the mechanism of Flow Tower and the importance of releasing his emotions, he couldn't squirm his way out of this if he wanted to master the flow strike. Naturally, having the company of such a talented man, young women like Trish and Carrie inevitably admired him. Just as they began to fantasize about him, Zen suddenly asked, now that I'm living alone in this courtyard house, can I bring my wives here? Letitia, Margaret, and the others had been staying in his inner world for a long time. It was time for them to come out and breathe a little fresh air. What, your wives? Trish and Carrie looked at each other with a confused expression. Trish answered, the courtyard house is allocated to you by Flow Sword Sect. The sect won't interfere, but you have been married. For them, Zen was quite young. They had never expected him to have been married. The news came as a shock to them. Yes, of course. If so, I'll invite them out, Zen said as he looked around. Chapter 2734, Dispute. In the blink of an eye, Zen turned into an incarnation and appeared in the fairy palace. As soon as the wives heard the news, their moods transformed instantly. Letitia's eyes flashed with excitement, her face filled with anticipation. Margaret started humming under her breath, unable to contain her joy and eagerness to accompany Zen. On the other hand, Aura remained calm. She was grateful Zen would come back to the fairy palace every now and then. As for Lavender, although she didn't say a word, she stopped her cultivation. Biting her lip, she was also curious about the legendary source world. In a flash of white light, they teleported to a courtyard, their faces eager and full of curiosity. Lavender stretched out her hand as though trying to touch the atmosphere. Sniffing, she said calmly, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference between this place and the divine land. Indeed, there is not much difference, Zen echoed with a curt nod. There was a huge gap between the universe and the divine land. After all, the universe was only an inner world, and it was essentially different from the real world with regards to rules. The divine land was created by Chiyu, but it wasn't any different from the source world. Margaret strolled around the courtyard, her eyes wandering. These courtyard houses were constructed for the elite disciples of the Flow Sword Sect. The pavilions and terraces were beautifully built. This wouldn't be a bad place to live, she thought to herself. However, she saw something that made her eyes narrow. Hurrying to Zen's side, Margaret pointed at the 2 women who stood nearby. Trish and Carrie exchanged uneasy glances, as Margaret said in a forced tone, these 2 beautiful girls must be your new girlfriends, right, dear? Zen knew that this would happen if he released Margaret. However, if he were to allow Letitia and the rest to come out without her, he knew she'd feel terrible. Just as he was about to explain, Carrie bowed humbly towards Margaret. "My lady, we are Mr. Luo's maids." Margaret blinked in confusion. Even Letitia, Lavender, and the other girls felt this was a bit peculiar. Given Zen's character, he certainly didn't need any maid, let alone 2 maids. "You are maids," Margaret chuckled. "Since we're here, there's no need for you to take care of Zen. You may leave now." Carrie, at a loss for words, glanced at Trish for help. Trish, on the other hand, just scowled. She eyed the women standing next to Zen, and suddenly felt uncomfortable. They were all good-looking and refined. Before this, she was under the impression that Zen focused on martial arts and was indifferent to love. Never could she have expected that he actually had a big family waiting for him in his inner world. But, on second thought, Zen was indeed an excellent man. It was no wonder he managed to attract the attention of many women. However, Margaret's searing words had left her feeling a bit depressed. After all of the suffering they'd been through, she and Carrie had finally gotten a chance to enter this courtyard house, thanks to Zen. And yet, Margaret wanted to chase them away just when they got here. "Don't you think you're being too overbearing, my lady?" said Trish in a restrained tone. Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "Overbearing? How dare you speak to me like that? You're just a maid. We are sent by the Flow Sword sect to take care of Mr. Luo, so you can't dismiss us. We need to report Mr. Luo's cultivation to the sect and inform him of the affairs of the sect." Trish remained level-headed. Margaret didn't reply. She didn't know what the Flow Sword sect was. Among the women in the fairy palace, Lavender was the only one who cared about cultivation. Every time he appeared, she would definitely ask for advice, and Zen would teach her everything he knew. Letitia, by contrast, cared about her husband's future, where he was, and what force he was in, and sometimes she would give him advice. As for Margaret, she never really thought about anything other than being with Zen. Trish's words immediately intimidated Margaret. Grasping for words, Margaret huffed and said, "Fine. You will only deliver messages, right?" She stretched out her hand. A purple sword suddenly materialized. With a gentle wave of her finger, the purple sword moved. Crack! The sword dragged its way down the courtyard, drawing a line. "I can take care of my husband," Margaret said haughtily. "You may have the other side of the courtyard. You may not cross this line unless you have a message to deliver." Seeing Margaret's arrogant expression, Trish was overwhelmed with anger. She had thought that this woman was gentle and handsome, and that she would be the easiest person to get along with. But it turned out that she was being the most unreasonable. Letitia and Lavender couldn't help but smile and titter at Margaret's rude behavior. They gotten used to her arrogance and bullying over the years. However, upon seeing Trish's and Carrie's distressed expressions, Letitia took the sword from Margaret. "Quit looking for trouble. Since Zen has joined the Flow Sword sect, he has to go by their rules. Don't make things difficult for him. This wasn't the Divine Land, it was the Oneness Sky Palace in the Source World. Her husband was just a disciple now. He couldn't be as presumptuous as he was back in the Divine Land." Letitia was keenly aware of this, while Margaret remained blissfully ignorant. Under the persuasion of Aura and Letitia, Margaret finally caved, but she still made a rule: Trish and Carrie couldn't enter Zen's room. The next few days passed peacefully. Trish left the courtyard house early in the morning and came back with a brocade box in her hands. She carried the brocade box and headed straight to the second floor of the house. Margaret leaned on the side of the corridor, effectively blocking Trish's way. "This is something secret that the Flow Sword sect has sent to Mr. Luo. I need to give it to him in person," said Trish through gritted teeth. The past few days, everyone had been having a good time, but Trish and Margaret still had some disputes. "I'll hand it over to my husband by myself. You cannot step into his room," Margaret said haughtily. "You have no right to touch such a precious thing." Trish could no longer contain her anger. "You." Margaret turned red. There was no way she would tolerate this. When she raised her hand to slap Trish on the face, someone suddenly coughed. The two women whipped their heads in the direction of the sound. Much to their surprise, there was a handsome, middle-aged man with a long beard standing in the courtyard. When Margaret sensed the aura of this middle-aged man, there was a trace of fear in her eyes. Even though she always went far in bullying others, she knew that this man's strength was formidable. "Let me personally send the manual on the flow swordsmanship in. I have something to say to Zen," Athamar said calmly. Then he came up to Trish, took the box in her hands, and walked directly into the room on the second floor. He placed the box in front of Zen, and then said with a smile, "You knew I came, but you didn't go out to welcome me, so I had to come to you in person. The new talent of the Flow Sword sect is truly conceited, huh? Chapter 2735, The Horrible Man. After their last encounter, Zen was sure that Athamar tended to do things according to what his heart dictated. With a smile, he asked, "How were you so sure that I'd choose the Flow Sword sect?" "Because I was waiting for you on the mountain. If you chose to join the Killing Sword sect or the Unique Array Sword sect, I would just have nudged you to choose otherwise." Athamar shrugged as though it was no big deal. Such a blunt reply left Zen speechless. Finally, he said, "That means you are indeed from the Flow Sword sect, right?" "That's right." Athamar nodded, and then pushed the brocade box towards Zen. "You have chosen 3 truth swordsmanship manuals. I believe you have achieved something on all of them. But I hope you can focus on the flow strike." "Why is that?" asked Zen curiously. He knew he had a lot to learn. The 1000 annihilation strike from the godly ways blending swordsmanship required constant training before any progress could be made. Now that Zen had the Eye of Will, he was looking forward to feeling the power of sword texture technique. Although he had almost learned all there was to it, he still needed time to master it. Also, he wanted to further study the 2 Sanskrit words Jeffrey helped translate for him. "Because we're running out of time," Athamar said in a suddenly serious tone. "You have to improve your cultivation base as soon as possible." Improving one's cultivation base meant that one had to travel to the other shore. But what did cultivating have to do with this? Observing Zen's confused face, Athamar continued, "To be precise, the flow strike is not a theurgy of sword skill, but a theurgy of mind cultivation. The most powerful thing about it doesn't lie in this world." "You mean it is on the other shore?" asked Zen incredulously. The flow strike was said to be training for the heart, but that was just an expression. In the past, people hadn't studied the secret of the soul thoroughly. They thought the soul was located in the heart, but in actuality, the soul was in the brain. In essence, the test Zen received in the Flow Tower was a test on his soul. "That's right," Athamar nodded in satisfaction. "But why are we running out of time?" Zen asked. "You are still in the first stage of the other shore realm, so you have no idea yet." Athamar paused, deep in thought. "First," he continued, "master the flow strike, then go to the other shore as soon as possible. This will allow you to grow more powerful. The Flow Sword sect will arrange for it." Apart from the godly ways blending swordsmanship, Zen had always struggled with gaining more divine megatons of force. If he could obtain another powerful other shore token from the other shore, his force would probably increase by several times. Without saying anything else, Athamar took his leave. What arrangements will the Flow Sword sect make? Zen wondered. He remembered what Dorothy had told him once. The palace had established its own forces and temple on the other shore, so they had easy access to other shore tokens and could arrange for their disciples to get relatively good ones. What Athamar said could be implying that the Flow Sword sect could obtain fancy other shore tokens easily as well. Now that Zen was thinking about it, it made sense that the palace would be keeping an eye out for their elite disciples. Why would they leave those precious young minds risking their lives when they had all the valuable other shore tokens at hand? If that was the case, he realized entering the other shore would do him some good. But before that, he had to follow Athamar's instructions and master the flow strike first. Zen opened the brocade box before him and took out the flow swordsmanship. Meanwhile, under the Nether Mountain, in the central part of the Square Captivity Province, a massive massacre was taking place. The Nether Mountain had 33 caves, in which 33 races gathered. The Nether Mountain was not very popular in the Source world, it only attracted branches of some races. The human race also had a branch there named 19th Cave Humans. There weren't many powerful warriors in the 33 caves. The best among the 19th Cave Humans were only at the second stage of the Other Shore realm, and the same went for the other races. Given the lack of competition, the 33 races had lived in peace together. If they were to encounter the invasion of some outsiders, they would join hands to defend the Nether Mountain together. However, what had happened that day shocked the 19th Cave Humans deeply. A strong scent of blood wafted to the 19th cave from the Nether Mountain. Several bats flew to the 19th cave, squeaking for help. "Please go talk to him, Squeak. Make him stop slaughtering our race." The head of the 19th Cave Humans waved them away with a bitter smile. "What can I do? You messed with that horrible man first. Squeak, we just fed on his bull lion. That's all. It was just one bull lion. Just one. We can give him 100 divine crystals for compensation. Or even 1,000. Why does he have to slaughter all of us?" The bat was growing desperate. Angrily, it flew at the head's face. "Aren't we supposed to support each other? Now our race is in trouble. You're just going to sit there and do nothing." The head of the 19th cave humans clenched his teeth and finally stood up. Gathering several able-bodied companions, he said, "I'll try to persuade him again." Then he jumped down from the hillside and landed at the foot of the Nether Mountain. He took a gander at the gory scene before him. Countless bats were torn into shreds, and the soil turned black, soaked in their blood. This was just the entrance to the cave. What horrors lay within the cave? Bang, bang, boom. Explosions could be heard from inside the third cave, where the bat race was located. Many bats were flying haphazardly, desperately trying to escape the cave. But whenever they got close to the exit, a flash of white light would instantly annihilate them. In the past, when faced with attacks, the 33 races would usually join hands to fight against the enemy. However, the Cyan spirit race from the second cave lost majority of its population to the horrible man, just because they tried to come to the bat race's aid. Even the head of the Cyan spirit race had been brutally murdered. It was no wonder no one else dared stand up to this man. Everyone else was cooped up in their caves, hoping the worst was over. The 19th cave humans initially didn't want to get involved either. However, this horrible man was a human. Thinking that he might stop if they tried talking to him, they had sent 2 19th cave humans to the third cave. They had barely stepped inside the cave when a white light flashed, and their heads rolled out onto the soil. Horrified by this scene, the 19th cave humans decided to stay out of this fight. The reason of this whole slaughter was the death of a bull lion. The horrible man had tied his tamed bull lion by the road. The bat race, living solely on blood, couldn't resist the temptation of the tied-up bull lion. Bull lion blood was extremely delicious, after all. But it turned out that they totally messed with the wrong bull lion. The bat race was getting slaughtered. If no one stepped in soon, they'd be completely annihilated. With a sigh, the head of the 19th cave humans decided he couldn't just sit and let that happen. Once he reached the entrance of the third cave, he took a deep breath, and tried to take a cautious peek inside. Just as he caught sight of the man, he was instantly knocked down by a tremendous force. When he finally realized what had happened, the man was already stepping on his chest, an evil smile plastered on his face. "I've been in this world for so long. There are all kinds of demons and monsters everywhere. I never thought I'd run into someone from the same race here. But, how dare you speak for those lowly creatures? You deserve to die." Chapter 2736, The Mysterious Woman in a Black Dress. The face of the leader of the 19th cave humans turned pale as his knees trembled out of fear. Desperate as he was, he begged for mercy in a pitiful state, "Please spare my life. I don't mean to speak for them." "Then what did you mean? Tell me." As the horrible man stomped his foot on the leader's chest with rage, the force under his feet surged and formed ripples far and wide. Crack, crack, the crackling sound of breaking ribs filled the air as the leader spat out blood from his mouth from his internal injuries. Just the simple act of the man's foot coming in contact with his chest had caused so much damage. Had he used more force, the leader's body would have been reduced to shreds. The bat race sucked your bull lion's blood, and they deserve to be killed," the leader said as he coughed out blood from his mouth. It was apparent he was only saying those things so the man could spare his life. "Humph, how nice of you. If only these non-human creatures would stop testing my patience. Since they refuse to, they are doomed. Not only will I end the bats, but I might as well kill every non-human creature in this mountain." The man sneered as he knocked his fists together to assert dominance. Why would you do such a thing?" The leader lowered his gaze to the ground in disbelief as he did not expect the man would be so unforgiving. When the non-human creatures witnessed the spectacle of his strength from afar, they did not dare to reveal themselves. The last thing they wanted was to face the same fate as the bat race and the Cyan spirit race, so they all hid in their caves and refused to come out. However, just as they heard the man's intentions towards them, their expressions changed considerably. "We have never even provoked him. Why does he want to annihilate us? In a situation like this, we don't have much choice but to fend for our lives. He might not be that strong since he just entered the other shore realm. We can all work together to attack him. Maybe he won't be able to handle all of us at once and will eventually die of exhaustion." These non-human creatures used their own languages to communicate among themselves. One by one, the enchanted barriers of the caves were removed, and the non-human creatures, big or small, powerful or weak, all emerged from their caves in what seemed like a swarm and dashed towards the man. Some of these creatures were large in terms of size and they looked strong. And some of them had tiny bodies covered with deadly toxins. Like moths to a flame, a mass of diverse non-human creatures from different races headed towards the man. Still with his foot on the leader's chest, the man applied pressure onto it to hear his groans and said, "You ask why? Ha ha ha, because those who don't belong to our kin cannot be trusted." Just as he finished his words, he turned his head to find the overwhelming numbers of the non-human creatures headed his way. He showed no fear, and the ends of his lips curved into a smirk as streams of crescent-shaped energy gathered around him. He had grown up from killing and slaughtering. The reason he told the leader was only a ruse to draw out angry non-human creatures to him. Back then, the number of people he had killed in contrast to the non-human creatures was over 10 times more. After annihilating all the prodigies of one continent, he would move to another, and he would not end his kill streak till he was the only one left in the world. Bang, bang, boom, as 3 bright balls of light flashed, the sounds they produced with every explosion were deafening. The energy emitted from the man's body was unique, and the creatures in the entire Nether Mountain failed to recognize its origins. They figured the energy was from a distinctive other shore token he might have obtained, but in fact, he had never used any. The intense shockwaves produced by the energy were so compelling that they destroyed the creatures who came in contact with them. Piles of broken limbs were scattered across the ground as the creatures fell one by one. In one round of slaughter, the man had destroyed the top-ranked warriors of the 33 caves without a hitch. The leader remained curled up on the ground watching the man who was floating in the sky. His eyes trembled in terror as he saw the man brutally kill off the non-human creatures without any hesitation on his face. Instead, he seemed to enjoy it. The leader had heard the powerful orthodox human forces would recruit some rare geniuses. But witnessing the man's strength in person, he realized no genius from any world would be able to defeat the monster in front of him. "What's wrong? Attack me, ha ha ha," the man roared, with his arms splayed out to them to invite them to attack him. The non-human creatures of the 33 caves felt the powerful force he unleashed and fell into despair. Many of them began to retreat. But he had no plans of letting them go. Suddenly, huge clouds of crescent-shaped energy rose beside him at his command and charged towards the non-human creatures. At the same time, a big black ship hovered over in the sky of the Square Captivity Province. The ship looked creaky and old, and emitted a heavy death aura. It looked as if a ghost was floating along the sky with a tattered appearance. What was more terrifying was its interior. The railings of the ship were decorated with skulls and bones of human race, sun crow race, and even some were of snake goddess race, heavenly joy race and flame race. Moreover, the owners of these bones had all gone through the chaotic source reinforcement before they died, and they were all powerful masters of their respective races. Crack! A pale hand appeared from the ship that knocked down a human skull from the railing. The hand belonged to a beautiful woman dressed in a long black gown. Albeit her charming profile, she seemed lifeless. If she stood motionless, anyone would mistake her for a corpse. Stepping forward, she grabbed the human skull and brought it close to her nose to take a whiff of it. Wisps of green mist emanated from the eyes of the skull and went straight into her nose and mouth. "There are plenty of bones on the ship. Why did you choose that skull?" a voice echoed from behind her. The owner of that voice was covered in black silk threads, so it was hard to make out the person's face. However, the person was as thin and tall as a bamboo pole. "After all, he was my lover who had been with me for 100,000 years. He tastes good actually," the woman in long dress said with a tantalizing smile and continued to suck the energy from the skull. An intoxicated expression was plastered across her face. "You're such a freak," the bamboo pole grumbled in an appalled voice. As they were immersed in conversation, they sensed a deep fluctuation in space from beneath the ship. Even though it was thousands of miles away, they could still feel the impact of it on the ghost-like ship. The woman in the black dress tilted her head to one side curiously. In doubt, she narrowed her eyes, and looked downwards where she felt the strong surge of energy. The bamboo pole felt it too. "Is this Wei's blending energy?" the woman in the black dress asked as she turned to her companion. "It is, no doubt about it. And the warrior has 12 layers of Wei's blending energy. This Wei's blending energy seems to be perfect," said the bamboo pole. "There is actually someone who cultivates Wei's blending energy these days. Now I'm curious to know who this warrior is. Shall I go down there to have a look?" the woman in the black dress asked. "Do as you please." The bamboo pole shook his head indifferently. "But don't cause trouble to delay the captain's business." At his approval, the woman flapped her black dress behind her as she turned to descend to the ground. She emitted strong death aura high in the sky and fell straight towards the Nether Mountain like a comet falling out of the sky that would bring death to any being that came in contact with it. Meanwhile, the foot of the Nether Mountain had become a cemetery of blood and limbs that scattered everywhere. The only race in the 33 caves that had survived was the human race. Nether Mountain has beautiful scenery, and it's a good place for cultivation. I've killed all the other races. If you submit to me, I'll forgive you, spare your lives and protect you, the horrible man said dominantly to the leader of the 19th cave humans. Forgive us. What crimes have we committed to ask for your forgiveness? The leader suppressed his thoughts in his mind and didn't dare to say them out loud. With the man's current temperament, the slightest of things could trigger him, and he would kill him immediately. As the leader nodded desperately, a heavy death aura emanated above their heads. The flesh and broken limbs on the ground seemed to have regained vitality the moment they were touched by the death aura. Sizz, blood began to flow into the broken limbs splayed out on the ground. Various ranges of blood from red, black, blue all followed suit as they came back to life. Countless broken limbs began to connect with the others. Among them were heads, arms, mouthparts, bones, so on and so forth. As they continued to combine, they turned into a huge monster. This monster's appearance was ghastly and hostile. One glance at it would make one want to throw up. As the vicious monster got up to stand on its 2 feet, a stunning woman in a black dress quietly appeared on top of its head. Chapter 2737, The Chaotic Source Reinforcement. The woman in the black dress was as beautiful as one could imagine, yet something about her made people uneasy in her presence. Perhaps it was pure intimidation. The man sensed her power, which certainly caught his attention. He grinned darkly and asked, "Who are you? You wish to know my name?" The woman smiled an evilly playful smile and offered a challenge, "Kill it, and you will find out." As the words rolled off her tongue, the monster beneath her feet began to stir. Dozens of broken arms and legs of all kinds crawled across the ground and rushed towards the man in a crazed hunger to tear him apart. The man snorted at the advancing monster and the wave's blending energy surged out in a torrent of waves. It then transformed into crescents and crashed into the monster. Bang, bang, powerful waves blending energy flew everywhere, some striking the woman. But it didn't bother her tender white skin in the slightest. It barely even shook her bangs, which hung still and heavy on her forehead. She did not care whether the monster could defeat the man. She merely used it as a means to observe the operation of the wave's blending energy. There are indeed 12 layers. In the past, there were 7 methods of using the wave's blending energy. One of the perfect ones was the godly wave's blending swordsmanship. People who created the 7 methods were of the same generation as the captain, but this person's method does not belong to any of the 7. Did a peerless master create this method? That can't be the case. The blending of godly ways has proven to be fruitless. No one would attempt it again. Is it possible he created it himself? The woman was staggered at the very idea of this. While she pondered these things, the monster under her feet had already suffered to the point that a large hole gaped in its body. If the man were to attack just a few more times, it would be shattered to pieces once more. "Show me your real strength," the woman in black said as she lightly tapped her toe on the ground. The black deathly energy flowed within the broken limbs and swirled around the monster. Its strength increased unbelievably while a violent, diabolical aura exuded from its body. Finally, the man's expression changed. "That's not enough." The man roared, releasing the wave's blending energy again. It was in the shape of crescents before, but it now morphed into a diamond with a layered surface. The woman in black glanced at it and soon deciphered the number of layers. "There are actually 21 layers. She exclaimed flabbergasted. She had struggled to figure out the number of layers from the crescent-shaped wave's blending energy with her eyes, but she could only sense it, which meant the man had controlled it pretty well. But he should have known that the more the layers, the harder it was for him to control the wave's blending energy. After reaching 12 layers, he could only change the shape and not hide the number of layers. This method might have been simple and crude, but it was effective and powerful. More importantly, he had definitely developed it himself. The woman was about to amplify the monster's strength even further when a deafening screech pierced her ears. The monster had already been turned to a pile of ashes. All she could see was a white glow enveloping her view. Before it cleared, a figure rushed at her. The man wrung her neck with one hand and planted his knee into her abdomen with such ferocity that the air around them shook. Bang! The woman was pressed to the ground. The man had acted swiftly, knowing the woman possessed a power beyond his imagination. If he wanted to have any sort of chance, he had to catch her unawares. "I like beautiful women like you. How about being my wife? Ha ha, that would be something, but it's a shame you have to die." He grinned devilishly as he gathered a diamond-shaped wave's blending energy and without hesitation stabbed it with all he could at the woman's face. 29 layers. My goodness, how many layers of the wave's blending energy can he summon? The woman in black didn't resist or move. All her attention was focused on the way's blending energy. She seemed not to care about life or death at all. Bang! Blazing white light exploded again. The man knew this power was enough to destroy anything. No matter how strong the woman was, she couldn't withstand a blow like that. When the light faded, there in front of the man, appeared the stunningly beautiful and unharmed face of the woman. There wasn't even a scratch on her. Even her hair spread loosely and perfectly on the ground. There was no trace of any kind of blow to her face, not even the slightest imperfection. Seeing the man's dumbfounded expression, the woman smiled sweetly and asked, "Have you heard of the chaotic source reinforcement?" She did not mind being held down by the man. She continued on, not bothered, as if telling a story. "When you reach a certain level on the other shore, there will be a limit for how many divine megatons of force you can bear. No matter who you are, you will not be able to take any more, or your body will be destroyed by the other shore power. If you want to continue to move forward on the other shore, you have to undergo the chaotic source reinforcement. This will strengthen your body considerably." "So, you have undergone the chaotic source reinforcement?" the man asked coldly and with a hint of a stammer. "Yes," the woman in black replied happily. "So no matter how strong you are now, you are like an ant biting a piece of iron. There is nothing you can do to hurt me." As those words fell on the man's ears, his soul sank and he wished he could disappear forever. He was highly talented, but it was a pity that he had been trapped in an inner world and knew too little about this place. The woman spoke of things beyond his imagination and comprehension. Even so, he had absolutely no intention of begging for mercy. He stared at the woman with an icy look, though he knew he was helpless now. He had just used all his strength and couldn't leave so much as a dent on the woman. What options did he have now? The woman twisted her body gruesomely and unnaturally. She slowly wrapped her arm around the man. Her seemingly soft body contained an immense amount of power, too much for him to fight against. It did not take long for her to push the man to the ground. She smiled down at the man full of glee and pity. "You are quite bold, but you are far from qualified to be my husband. How about my disciple instead?" The man didn't expect such a request. If it were someone else, they would have agreed immediately. But now, the man laughed grimly. "Since I, the evil god, was born, I've been self-taught. No one in this world can be my master. I'd rather you kill me." "Oh, your name is Evil God. Interesting." The woman could not hold back her laughter on hearing such an arrogant name. "Do you really think I can't kill you because you have a rebirth land?" she asked, giggling and shaming the man. Chapter 2738, Shira. Terror flashed across the evil god's face as the woman in black dress exposed his secret. The existence of the rebirth land was a fetter and a form of protection to the evil god at the same time. But if the rebirth land could be so easily destroyed, this protection would become a white elephant. "Just try and kill me if you can," the evil god sneered. He was a formidable man, aloof to the thought of life and death. After all, he had few things to worry about. The woman sized up the evil god, a beginner in the other shore realm, with a wide smile on her face. "If that's the case, I will satisfy you," the woman said, still smiling. She brought up her fingertips to his face, gently touching his forehead. "Wait," the evil god stopped her. "Afraid of death," she said scornfully. She had seen many people act like this. They appeared impassioned, even cocky, before death came. But once it came, they got cold feet. This man before her might also be a wimp. The evil god snorted. "I've already killed that monster. Can I have your name?" The woman was stunned, but she recovered soon enough and said, a smile growing on her lips, "My name is Shira." The evil god closed his eyes at the name. He didn't look terrified even though he was about to face death. A ghastly-looking death aura then sprawled from her fingertips. It wasn't long before the evil god stiffened and fell into a daze. He was an amazing talent, full of an irascible perversity. He should belong to the black ship. She wouldn't kill him, obviously. She lifted the evil god while she stared at the leader of the 19th cave humans some distance away with her striking eyes. The leader's heart skipped a beat when he met her gaze. But she merely began walking, and then gained speed before she galloped upwards. The leader heaved a long sigh of relief once she left with the evil god. If the horrible man was an existence that they could not provoke, then the woman was an existence they dared not have eye contact with. How could their little nether mountain encounter such an existence and survive? Almost all the races of the other 32 caves had died. But fortunately, the humans were fine. Although the horrible man was ferocious, he did care about people who were from the same race as him. The leader had just begun to celebrate his good fortune when suddenly, the sound of flowing water reached his ears. The fragments of corpses and amputated limbs within the 32 caves were once again merging together into huge monsters. These monsters, armed with wings and bone blades, wrapped in sinister deathly energy, swarmed towards the leader in the 19th cave. A loud thump sounded. The evil god was thrown onto the deck of the ghost ship, his limbs flailing like a dead animal's. The bamboo coal stared at the evil god before he sighed. There are 29 layers of ways-blending energy. If he has really comprehended it by himself, he truly possesses a remarkable power of perception. He has probably mastered it on his own. He'd rather die than take a master, Shira said. It's a pity that he is reluctant to take someone as his master. But most people with great talents act like this, the bamboo coal said. He paused for a second before asking, are you planning to turn him into a puppet, or do you have other plans? Shira responded with a smile, I want him to join the black ship. The man looked dazed before he recovered enough to ask rather breathily, are you crazy? There has been a vacancy on the black ship since one of us was killed by the snake goddess race, she said, leaning against the railings and pressing her arms around a skeleton. The captain is bound to agree. There's no way he could join us even if he's insanely talented. He's too weak, the bamboo coal murmured, shaking his head. That's none of your concern. I have my own ways, she said flatly. The evil god now had nothing to offer to the black ship, but that didn't mean he wouldn't be of use sometime in the future. The black ship did not belong to any kind of super forces. It even had conflicts with most super forces in the source world, which was why they weren't able enough to sift and pick talents from all around the source world. It had become difficult to reinforce the black ship with newcomers. To Shira's satisfaction, the evil god was perfect for that vacancy. You can explain this to the captain yourself, the bamboo coal said, no longer against her decision but not comfortable with talking to the captain about it either. The ship sailed away and soon disappeared as the death aura spread around it. At the foot of the Nether Mountain, everything was restored to calm after a length of chaos, leaving only a smell of blood drifting with the wind. Another month passed. Zen asked Trish to take the sword-reading liquid to the bottom of the mountain again. He also got some news from her when she returned. Gant had finally won himself a chance to go up the mountain from Cellars. But he had been stranded halfway up the mountain. Apart from glowing recommendations, one's strength was also a major factor in helping them conquer the mountain. It was obvious that Gant wasn't qualified enough. Over the past month, Zen had spent most of his time studying the flow strike. He had comprehended it and discovered that the flow strike was not as simple as he had thought it was. It was true that the cultivation of the emotion-closing godly way could be the foundation of the flow strike, but there was a great gap between them. Comprehending the flow strike required calmness. It didn't matter that he had reached the 10th floor of the flow tower. He had only been able to grasp a small part of the flow strike in a month. He couldn't be fully occupied with cultivating the flow strike. Improving his cultivation level on the other shore was equally important. He believed that the other disciples of the Flow Sword sect would also invest some time to the other shore apart from having fun in their houses. On the first day of the month, Zen chose to cultivate in seclusion. This time, Zen entered the other shore with his physical body after burning himself with fire. The last time around, he had wanted to explore the sacred Mallow Temple thoroughly, but had been interrupted by the Sun Crow race's intrusion into the Blue Cloud City. He could now explore it, fully and at his will. Zen was now on a beach with golden sand. It wasn't a good time yet to break through to the other shore, so there was no soul of light on this beach. He looked around as he walked on. The topography of stage 1 of the other shore was pretty simple. Zen could easily find his way to the sacred Mallow Temple based on his memory. On his way, Zen remembered the shade stone that was inside his body. Since the shade stone had been melted into one with him, and his body had already entered the other shore, had this stone been brought here too? As far as Zen knew, it was difficult to bring external objects out of the source world into the other shore. Only two kinds of things could be taken into the other shore. One was the soul pill, and the other was the other shore key. Thinking of this, Zen tried to manifest the shade stone on his arm. No reaction, he murmured, shaking his head and smiling. He had underestimated the other shore. If it really was so simple, so many creatures in the source world wouldn't have had to risk so much to cross the sea of truth. Zen decided to leave this attempt behind and resumed his journey. It was not long before the sacred Mallow Temple came into view. Chapter 2739, Complicated Deals. The last time Zen came to the sacred Mallow Temple, there were 3 groups of people waiting there. The disciples of the small forces had managed to reach the other shore with a few soul pills to their names. However, the real obstacle standing in their way was the other shore keys. Even those of stage 1 were hard to get, so they would often try their luck at the entrances of the temples. It was common for them to wait there for 10 or 15 days, sometimes even 2 months. Compared to the last time, Zen was shocked to see over 100 people were waiting outside of the temple. As soon as he appeared on the scene, everyone directed their attention towards him. It was a rare sight to see a physical body appear on the other shore, and they began to whisper among themselves while staring at his profile. As Zen made his way towards the gate of the sacred Mallow temple, the people saw a glimmer of hope and followed close behind him. When he looked back to see the swarm of people crowding up towards him, he couldn't help but frown. Although the thing in the crack at the top of the temple couldn't be taken away by anyone else, he still didn't want anyone to see it. "Sir, can you open the door of the temple?" a middle-aged man asked politely, bowing to Zen. The group of souls of light knew their place in contrast to Zen. They were inferior in power, so they showed him respect. Upon hearing his question, Zen turned around to look at the people surrounding him with hopeful eyes. Once he opened the door for them, they would all flock inside. "Yes, I can," Zen replied with a slight nod. At this answer, their eyes lit up with joy, and their faces relaxed. They had been waiting for days. Finally meeting someone owning a key to the gate made them disregard everything. Amid their happiness, they even forgot about how Zen had entered the other shore with his physical body intact. "That would be great, haha." The middle-aged man laughed heartily, and everyone else got ready to head inside. "But I will enter the sacred Mallow temple by myself. Please don't follow me," Zen requested equally respectfully. The rejection hit them hard as their smiles were wiped clean off their faces. "But, the sacred Mallow temple is so big. We can go in together. I promise we won't get in your way." "Yeah, it's a waste for you to go inside all by yourself after using one other shore key." "Sir, we are all from the same human race. I beg you to reconsider. We should help each other." Some people began to beg him with desperate eyes to allow them in with him. But, nothing was going to move Zen into changing his decision. He was firm on going in alone. While he studied the foundation of the dilapidated temple, a thought dawned on him. He turned to the people again and asked, "You haven't merged with any other shore token, have you?" "Yes, we made it to the other shore not long ago. I've only been here for 2 months, and I haven't found any proper other shore token." Zen shook his head at their answers and pointed at the temple. "Look over there. The bricks and stones of the temple can be used as your other shore tokens." Although the sacred Mallow temple was in stage 1, its bricks and stones still contained considerable other shore power. At least they held more value than the other shore tokens of stage 1. Zen had planned on knocking these stones and bricks down earlier, but now he had the chance of going through with it. "Do you mean these bricks and stones? Can you knock them down? If you can get 1 brick, I will offer you 100 soul pills for it." "Forget 100, I will offer 200 for 1. There were always some instances where people would obtain the bricks of rundown temples and use them as their other shore tokens. However, although the sacred Mallow temple looked like it had weak foundations, it was hard for them to extract its bricks. The group realized Zen was their only hope in obtaining the bricks since he had come with his body. After a quick bid among the people, someone offered 500 soul pills. Since they had waited painfully long in front of the temple, they didn't have a lot of soul pills left in their possession. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, Zen walked to a corner of the temple, clenched his fists and began to summon his energy. Bang! As his bare knuckle made contact with the brick, a crack formed all over it. Bang! After he threw in his second punch, half of a brick fell off from the temple and dropped near his feet. Zen picked up the broken square brick and raised it before the crowd. "Well, I am not greedy. I will offer this brick for 300 pills. What do you think?" He barely even finished his sentence when a man quickly rushed to him and dropped 300 soul pills at his feet. "Here are 300 soul pills. I'll take it." These people had known the strength of these bricks. The other shore power each of these bricks contained was at least 5 or 6 divine megatons, making them top-grade other shore tokens of stage 1. Zen raised the brick and waved it in front of the man. "I have another condition. You can't follow me into the temple. Instead, you must guard the door for me." "Understood, no problem at all." The man swiftly agreed and nodded aggressively. Initially, these people wanted to enter the temple to gather other shore tokens. But since their purpose was fulfilled with the bricks, they had no desire to go inside. The temples were known to have many dangers inside of them. Going in there would mean inviting unnecessary risk to themselves. Then Zen began to knock the bricks down one by one. Since he merged with the Eye of Will, he had the help of the dreaded demon race. Therefore, he didn't wish to demolish their temple. With careful hands, he knocked down only half of a brick along the periphery each time and then sold them for soul pills. Not everyone was able to take out so many soul pills. Some people didn't want to miss this opportunity, so they quickly retreated from the other shore and stocked up on soul pills to give to Zen in exchange for other shore tokens. On the other hand, those who obtained the bricks couldn't wait to merge with them. However, now Zen was faced with a new problem. After more than 10 deals, he had acquired too many soul pills but had no place spacious enough to store them. He could put all the things, regardless of their sizes and amount, in his space ring in the source world. The souls of light could also store some items. For example, Zen had stashed candles in his. Zen couldn't absorb these soul pills into his body. He had received Dorothy's help before, but because he had been away from the other shore for so long, she might have already left stage 1. He also couldn't trust these people. If they took the soul pills he earned and left the other shore, retrieving them would be impossible. The deals on the other shore were quite risky. The Mice League and some great commercial alliances had a full set of rules to avoid risks. Zen didn't know what their methods were, so he had to come up with other ways. He thought for a moment before he stopped knocking the bricks. Then he put more than 2,000 soul pills at the gate of the sacred Mallow temple and called out to the people, "Those who haven't obtained the bricks yet are going to guard these pills for me till I'm back." These people were waiting for the bricks impatiently. Although over 2,000 soul pills was not a small amount, they were more interested in the bricks. They didn't want to offend Zen by stealing his pills, especially since he was the only one who could get them what they wanted. After Zen exited the other shore, he took out the other shore key and recited the Sanskrit words that Jeffrey deciphered for him. Tiny lines continuously orbited his palm. Upon activating the other shore key, Zen once again appeared in front of the sacred Mallow temple. Calmly, he closed his eyes, put his hand on the door of the temple and opened it. Then he moved all the soul pills to a hidden corner of the temple and continued to knock the bricks. Before long, most of these 100 people received their respective square bricks. Now, they had to keep their end of the deal and help Zen guard the entrance of the sacred Mallow temple. Zen walked into the temple and left the other shore again. Before he entered, he activated the truth of godly way and went to the other shore with his soul of light. The people outside had no clue that Zen's body had left, so they still guarded the door. He could only be able to take the soul pills if he entered the temple with his soul of light. However, just as Zen's soul of light had stepped foot on the other shore, he encountered Dorothy's soul of light. Zen looked at Dorothy, with his head tilted to the side dumbfounded. He never expected her to still be where they left last time. Chapter 2740, Metal Flower Branch. Don't tell me you've done nothing but wait here. Although he had just said that, Zen sensed a big difference in Dorothy's soul of light. The power hidden within was several times stronger than before. Of course not, I have already entered stage 4. Dorothy replied, displeased. She waited for Zen here, but he left for the Blue Cloud City without notifying her. If it weren't for the fact that someone didn't allow her to leave the Bloom Divine Province, she might have gone after him. Hold on, stage 4, so soon. Zen took a few steps back as he stared at her completely awestruck. However, Dorothy was casual about her achievement. I have absorbed the soul crystal. You should have been more amazed if I hadn't reached stage 4. I would have progressed even further if I wasn't waiting for you. To be fair, the other shore was vast. It wasn't so accurate to divide the different cultivation bases by stages of the other shore. Dorothy stood with her arms crossed and an agitated vein protruded from her forehead as she was displeased with Zen. Affectionately, he lightly patted her on the head and ruffled her hair. All right, I won't do that again. Come on, let's go. We have some soul pills to collect. There are too many, and I don't know what to do with them. Too many soul pills? Where did you get them from? Dorothy tilted her head in confusion and followed Zen obediently. Just come with me, and you'll see, Zen said with a smile. Following Zen, Dorothy found herself back at the entrance of the sacred Mallow temple. As they approached it, the 100 people Zen left behind to guard the gate for him were keeping their end of the deal and stood firm blocking it. When the people saw two strangers approach the entrance, they were immediately alerted and straightened themselves up nervously. Both Zen and Dorothy had absorbed the soul crystal. Moreover, Dorothy was already at the 4th stage of the other shore realm, and she had been cultivating the grand fighting soul formula. Her mere presence was overwhelming and imposed pressure on those people. Regardless of the situation, one of the men guarding the entrance stepped up and walked over to them. You are not allowed to go any further. Someone powerful is in there. They knew that they didn't stand a chance against these two. Their best bet was to intimidate them with Zen instead. Why should I listen to you? Dorothy began to walk over to argue, but Zen stopped her by blocking her way with his hand. As she looked at him questioningly, he shook his head and turned to the people. There's no need for you to be so nervous. Just let us in. They took their time to recognize who he was because he was in the form of Soul of Light. Even so, he resembled a lot with his physical body. Though his face was hard to make out for them, they identified him by his voice. It's you. Is this your Soul of Light? They narrowed their eyes, seemingly confused. When they first saw Zen appear on the other shore with his physical body, naturally, they thought he was something special. They had never seen anyone appear in any form other than their Soul of Light, and they even concluded Zen to be an aboriginal. But now they found out that Zen had a Soul of Light. It's me indeed, Zen replied politely. Hearing his voice, they cleared the way for both of them to pass through and enter the sacred Mallow Temple. Why are they so obedient to you? Dorothy was impressed by the scene she had witnessed. But her surprise didn't end here. She was even more shocked when Zen led her to a secluded corner of the temple where he had stashed the 20,000 soul pills. Normally, an ordinary thing like soul pills wouldn't affect her. However, they were at stage 1, and finding them in abundance in such a barren place was rare. I smashed down the bricks of the temple and sold them to those people outside, Zen answered, studying Dorothy's shocked yet confused expression. You knocked down the bricks? Dorothy stared at him in utter disbelief. She recalled Zen had mentioned this idea to her when he first came to the sacred Mallow Temple, but she never thought he would put it into practice. I sold them at a cheap price, and so they were grateful. Zen gave his shoulders a light shrug, then switched his gaze to the pills. There are so many of them. I can't figure out where to store them. As far as Zen knew, only the Soul of Light could hold things within on the other shore. The physical body couldn't keep anything. But the space in the Soul of Light was limited. It was hard to put so many soul pills into it. It's indeed troublesome to carry so many soul pills, but, staring at the massive pile, she reached out her hand, and a ray of light spiraled around her fingers and formed a square. Surprised by her gesture, Zen glanced at the square and could feel the truth of void destruction fluctuate within it. Is this a space ring? There are space rings on the other shore as well. That's right, Dorothy nodded approvingly and continued, but a space ring is not easy to make on the other shore. One must cultivate the truth of void destruction to a very advanced level. You've already joined the Flow Sword sect. When you reach stage 4, the palace will give you one. As she spoke, she knelt near the pills and aimed her space ring at them. Phew, while the space ring flashed in front of them, it acted like a vacuum as the soul pills quickly got sucked in one by one. She would keep them in her possession until Zen needed them. All right, let's go. Dorothy got up and signaled Zen to leave. Wait, hold on for a second. Zen stopped her in her tracks by shaking his head. Why, what's wrong? She was confused by his sudden claim, as she couldn't understand why he would want to stay in the sacred Mallow Temple. The last time she came with Zen, they were lucky to have obtained a big ball of soul crystal. Other than that, there was nothing special. There should be something inside here, Zen said with a firm tone. Really, how are you so sure? Dorothy asked curiously. Just wait and watch. Zen's soul of light faded away and he came back in his physical body. Then, Dorothy followed him around the temple, and they headed to the spiral-shaped stairs that led to the top. Following Zen's gaze, Dorothy noticed a crack on the wall at the further end of the top floor. I found this crack the last time we came, but couldn't break it with the soul of light. This time, it would be different. He pointed towards the crack, while closing his distance. As he was a few feet away from it, he focused his power onto his fist and jabbed at the crack. Bang! The temple wasn't strong enough to resist his punch. As a result, the crack expanded when his fist came in contact with it. After a few more of his blows, the wall caved in and collapsed. I knew it. As Zen expected, there was a secret room behind the crack. When they peered into the place, it was pitch black and desolate. However, as they examined more intently, the view of a floating silhouette made their eyes glisten under the dark setting of the room. It was in the shape of a flower branch glimmering in the dark, and it was intricately carved with metal. The shiny flower branch rotated slowly in the air, graciously providing the mysterious room with its light. It does not have any other shore power, Dorothy exclaimed, keeping her eyes fixated on the metal branch. Almost everything on the other shore contained other shore power, from a grain of sand to an entire temple. The only deciding factor was how much other shore power they had. This flower branch was quite rare since they couldn't sense any other shore power emanating from it. How come something like this exists in the temple of the dreaded eye demons? Zen had expected something more. He had hoped that there would be some other shore token more powerful than the Eye of Will in this secret room, but this flower branch didn't seem to have any energy and thus couldn't be fused.